Chapter 1401 Supreme Tower. Chapter 1401 Supreme Tower. The disciples on Titanic Star were chatting casually. They did nothing to conceal their conversation, and Jian Wushuang heard them clearly. Jian Wushuang looked cold, and he couldn't be bothered with their conversation, so he walked into the wormhole straight away. Virum. There was a flash of light, and Jian Wushuang appeared in a dark palace. The palace was extremely spacious. He couldn't see the end of it with his naked eyes. In the middle of the palace, there were 3 figures standing in line. The 3 of them hold a saber each. War puppet. Jian Wushuang looked at the 3 tall, sturdy figures before him. The 3 training places in Lineage of Star. I've tried Star Tower and Illusionary Mind Sea, but I've never tried Supreme Tower before. Jian Wushuang smiled faintly. Blood Mountain sword appeared in his hand. Swoosh, swoosh, swoosh. The 3 figures moved simultaneously. They took 1 step and appeared before Jian Wushuang instantly. Then they slashed. The 3 swords descended at the same time. Jian Wushuang stood there, but he didn't block with his sword. There was a surge of soul power that flowed out and suddenly gathered to become a black tortoise. It covered Jian Wushuang's body and performed its terrifying defense power. Dang! 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 The 3 slashes were blocked by the black tortoise shell. At the same time, the counter-impact sent the 3 war puppet backwards. How could the attack power of the 3 war puppets be so weak? Jian Wushuang was shocked. However, Jian Wushuang creased his eyebrows again very soon. That's not right, their power is increasing constantly. I see. The power of the war puppet would have increased along with the passing of time. No wonder the longer one stays in Supreme Tower, the more powerful one is. Jian Wushuang understood, and his soul power swept out the next moment. It then formed into 3 soul thorns, and shot towards the 3 war puppets. The 3 soul thorns flew through the war puppets' bodies without any hindrance, but it didn't have any effect on the 3 war puppets. The 3 war puppets continued to charge towards him at a terrifying speed. My opponents are war puppets and they are dead. They don't have any consciousness. My soul attack has no effect on them at all. Jian Wushuang's face grew grave. What he was good at wasn't swordsmanship and close combat power, but soul attacks. However, in Supreme Tower, in a situation where his opponents were war puppets, he was obviously at a disadvantage. A major disadvantage. My magic and any other attack that aims at spirit or consciousness are useless. I can only depend on 5 Beast Soul Manipulation knack to do consolidated attack. Jian Wushuang's eyes were giving out electric sparks, and he waved his hands. Roar! An earth-shattering roar was heard. Then there were 3 huge purple tigers that charged towards the 3 war puppets like lightning. On Titanic Star, the disciples were waiting in silence. In the Milky Way, Hall Master Yuan and the dozen Deacon Elderlies were waiting as they focused on what was happening in Supreme Tower. Although there wasn't any image, the Deacon Elderlies could see what was going on in Supreme Tower clearly. At that very moment, the Deacon Elderlies looked surprised. A consciousness attack. Such a strong consciousness attack. Among universe gods in the 2nd heaven and Lineage of Star, there is one who is good with consciousness attacks. He is very impressive in performing the consciousness attack. The Deacon Elderlies were all powerful real gods. Everyone had great foresight, and they could tell that Jian Wushuang was giving play to an unusual consciousness attack. However, they didn't recognize that it was 5 Beast Soul Manipulation knack. This young man is Jian Wushuang who Lei Bao brought back not long ago, right? The Deacon Elderlies looked at Lei Chao. It's him, Lei Chao nodded. I thought that the young man was extremely weak and didn't qualify to be a disciple of Star Palace. But now, the Deacon Elderlies had a strange look. Previously, Jian Wushuang's matter had stirred a commotion in Lineage of Star. Many Deacon Elderlies were shocked, and there were even Deacon Elderlies that suspected before. Dealing with the suspicion, Hall Master Yuan didn't explain much, and merely told them to judge by the outcome of the battle. Then the matter was brushed off. But then, Jian Wushuang's power showed in Supreme Tower had exceeded their expectations. Everyone might not know that Jian Wushuang passed through the 19th floor in Illusionary Mind Sea few days ago. Hall Master Yuan said with a smile. 90th floor. Doesn't it mean that his consciousness strength has reached the level of a peak universe god in the third heaven? The deacon elderlies were dumbfounded. And then they understood why Jian Wushuang was qualified to be a disciple of Star Palace. Time flew past and Jian Wushuang walked out from Supreme Tower soon. When he appeared on Titanic Star, the surrounding disciples looked at him with astonishment. 17 breaths. Jian Wushuang had stayed in the Supreme Tower for 17 breaths? 17 breaths already surpassed most of the disciples. As for the duration in Supreme Tower, he should be on the 11th. 800 years ago he was at the bottom among all ordinary disciples. But now he is at the 11th? The disciples found it unbelievable. Of course, there were people who didn't care. Such as the 4 disciples of Star Palace, such as Luo Quan, Lu Han, and a few top ordinary disciples, who couldn't be bothered. 17 breaths, not too shabby. Unfortunately, he won't even have a chance to join the second round. Luo Quan smirked. Jian Wushuang has improved quite greatly within the 800 years. Lu Han stole a glance at Jian Wushuang but sneered. However, he only stayed in the tower for 17 breaths while I stayed in the tower for 18 breaths. I am stronger than he is. Among all the disciples that participated, I am at the 10th. If there's no surprises, I will be among the 10 disciples who join the second round. As for Jian Wushuang, on the 11th, he will be eliminated. The 10 disciples who joined the second round of rotation battle were normally foreseen, according to the duration, they stayed in Supreme Tower. The duration he had stayed in the tower was longer than Jian Wushuang. Hence, he naturally thought that he definitely would be joining the second round of rotation battle, rather than Jian Wushuang. After Jian Wushuang, there were a few disciples who also got into the tower. Very soon, all 52 universe gods in the second heaven went through the tower. Next, Hall Master Yuan and the deacon elderlies discussed in the boundless Milky Way, and then went to announce the results. Chapter 1402. I refuse to accept. Chapter 1402. I refuse to accept. In the boundless Milky Way, Hall Palace Yuan, Lei Chao and the other dozens of deacon elderly gathered together. I drafted a disciple name list of who is going to join the second rotation battle. Look and see if there's any problem. Hall Master Yuan showed the name list to everyone. In Hall Master's point of view, his drafted name list naturally wouldn't have any problems. The deacon elderlies only casually took a glance, and they agreed in unison. The name list in their heart was the same as the name list that Hall Master Yuan showed them. As there's no problem, let me announce the results. Hall Palace Yuan took a stride, and his lofty voice reverberated throughout the entire Titanic Star. Whoever's name is called up can join the second round of the rotation battle. Every disciple in Titanic Star held their breath and waited. Ling Feibai. Ling Feibai was the first who was called. No one was surprised. He was widely acknowledged as the top genius. Then, the other 3 disciples of Star Palace were called, including Xiafeng. They were followed by Luo Quan and the others. Hall Palace Yuan read 9 names altogether. At the 10th he paused slightly. Hall Master Yuan had yet to read out the name, but disciples on Titanic Star couldn't help but look towards Lu Han. Everyone saw their performance in Supreme Tower more clearly. As for the duration they stayed in Supreme Tower, Lu Han was at the 10th. In other words, the last person's name should be his. According to the duration one stayed in Supreme Tower, the last name is definitely mine. Lu Han was confident. Hall Master Yuan finally spoke. The last one, Jian Wushuang. Just as he finished the announcement, all the disciples on Titanic Star were surprised. Lu Han, who was full of confidence, suddenly flushed with anger. Jian Wushuang? How could it be Jian Wushuang? Lu Han roared. His bloodshot eyes fixed their gaze on Jian Wushuang. However, he saw Jian Wushuang stood there coldly, and didn't bother with his gaze, or the surrounding crowd's gaze. No, impossible. Lu Han started bellowing in anger. According to the duration we stayed in Supreme Tower, I stayed for 1 breath longer than Jian Wushuang. I am above him. How could the last quota for second rotation battle not be my name, but his? This is unfair. I refuse to accept this. Lu Han's bellows reverberated through the entire Titanic star, and many disciples creased their eyebrows. Most of these disciples agreed with what Lu Han said. When Jian Wushuang first came to Lineage of Star and showed his ability, it had stirred up a commotion in Lineage of Star. A disciple of Star Place was far behind an ordinary disciple of the same rank. By then, most of them already found it unfair. However, due to the battle approaching, the commotion subsided. Then, before everyone's eyes, everyone could tell that Lu Han had stayed longer than Jian Wushuang in the Supreme Tower. But the last quota was still given to Jian Wushuang. It was not only Lu Han who had refused to accept the result, but the other disciples too. Lu Han even glared at Hall Master Yuan and other higher-ups in the boundless Milky Way. He continued to rage. This is not fair. I will not accept this. Although even if he were to participate in the second rotation battle, it was impossible for him to grab the quota to become disciples of Star Palace. At least he tried. But then he didn't even have a chance. Plus, if Jian Wushuang did win against him with his ability, so be it. The most important part was that Jian Wushuang obviously couldn't compare favorably with him in regards of duration in Supreme Tower. Of course, he refused to accept it. Looking at the scene on Titanic Star, Hall Master Yuan squinted his eyes while the other Deacon Elderlies looked embarrassed. The result was a mutual decision of Hall Master Yuan and all the Deacon Elderlies. We all agreed that Jian Wushuang is more qualified to participate in the second rotation battle than you, Lu Han. One of the Deacon Elderlies shouted. Mutual decision? All the disciples on Titanic Star stunned. If it was only Hall Master Yuan who was biased, so be it. But all the Deacon Elderlies had mutually agreed with the result. It couldn't be that all the Deacon Elderlies were biased, right? Lu Han. A cold voice was heard. The one who spoke was Lei Chao. Mr. Lei Chao. Lu Han quivered and there was a flash of terror in his eyes. I know that you stayed longer in the Supreme Tower than Jian Wushuang. You think that he couldn't be compared favorably to you. So it's normal that you refuse to accept the result. However, if you're unhappy with the result, you can continue to watch the battle. Watch the second rotation battle, and see Jian Wushuang's power with your own eyes. Complain then. Now, Hall Master Yuan just announced the result, and you question the result. Humph. You have guts. Do you think you're Ling Fei Bai? Lei Chao's voice was cold. Lu Han quivered in shock, and he suddenly awakened. True. Regardless, he was merely an ordinary disciple in Lineage of Star. There were many ordinary disciples of his standard in Lineage of Star. Then, he who was an ordinary disciple pointed a finger at Hall Master Yuan and questioned the result of the discussion amongst Hall Master Yuan and the other Deacon Elderlies. Am I crazy? Lu Han quivered. Then, Hall Master Yuan finally looked down at Lu Han. His voice was extremely cold too. Stand by the side and watch. If, when the second rotation battle ends, you still think that Jian Wushuang shouldn't be compared favorably with you, I will give you what you deserve, and I will apologize to everyone and admit that I'm biased. However, if Jian Wushuang were to be stronger than you, then you will return to where you came from. Then, everyone on Titanic Star gasped and looked at Lu Han simultaneously. Return to where you came from. It meant that he would be kicked out from Lineage of Star. Lu Han was extremely shocked. He mumbled but couldn't utter another word. All right, be prepared for the second rotation battle. Hall Master Yuan waved his hand impatiently. Along with Hall Master Yuan's instruction, the battle continued. After the chaos that Lu Han caused, everyone who was originally still doubtful of Jian Wushuang's capability didn't dare to think so anymore. Hall Master Yuan and the rest of the Deacon Elderlies think that Jian Wushuang is stronger than Lu Han. If it was just Hall Master Yuan, it wouldn't be a big deal. The crucial part is that all Deacon Elderlies thought so too. It definitely isn't because Hall Master Yuan is biased, but Jian Wushuang really has the ability. Definitely. Otherwise, why would Hall Master Yuan say so, and even promise to apologize publicly? From what I can see, Hall Master Yuan wouldn't apologize if Lu Han is doomed. Chapter 1403 First Battle. Chapter 1403 First Battle. In boundless Milky Way, Hall Master Yuan and his fellow Deacon Elderlies were chatting casually. Lu Han is so stupid. Who does he think he is? He thought that he was Ling Fei Bai? He's just an ordinary disciple. How dare he be in doubt of the result that Hall Master Yuan and us Deacon Elderlies agreed upon? He thought Jian Wushuang didn't stay in Supreme Tower as long as he did, and assumed that Jian Wushuang couldn't be stronger than him. What a joke. Whoever stayed longer in Supreme Tower is stronger. Ridiculous. The Deacon Elderlies saw clearly how long Jian Wushuang had stayed in Supreme Tower earlier. They were sure that Jian Wushuang was definitely stronger than Lu Han, and by a considerable amount. The reason Jian Wushuang only stayed in Supreme Tower for 17 breaths was that the opponent that he was fighting against was a war puppet. An expert who is good at consciousness attack fights against war puppets won't have any conscious. Jian Wushuang was at great disadvantage, but, even so, he stayed for 17 breaths. Plus, if I'm not mistaken, Jian Wushuang only used the consciousness manipulation method in Supreme Tower, and didn't perform any consciousness secret skills or anything. He didn't even use any swords principles. His power should not have to be put to play entirely. If he were to give his all, even if he was at a great disadvantage as he fought against a war puppet, he should be able to persist for a longer time. A Deacon Elderly in a gold robe casually commented, Look. Jian Wushuang is going to take action. Hall Master Yuan and the other Deacon Elderlies looked towards Titanic Star. On Titanic Star, the rotation battle had begun. Similarly to the rotation battle among Universe God in the First Heaven, the 10 disciples took turns to fight against one another. Everyone had to fight 9 battles. The very first battle was between Jian Wushuang and Luo Quan. When the Deacon Elderly on Titanic Star announced the two of them for the first battle, it stirred a commotion on Titanic Star in that instant. One opponent was Jian Wushuang, who had been a controversial person for the past 800 years. Especially as everyone was still in doubt of his power, he immediately had to take action. The other one was publicly known as the strongest ordinary disciple among universe gods in the second heaven. Plus, it so happened that the first person that Jian Wushuang had lost to after he had got to Lineage of Star was Luo Quan. The two of them were enemies to begin with. Before everyone's gaze, Jian Wushuang walked to the middle of Titanic Star slowly. Just as Luo Quan was going to walk forward, Chu Yang, who was behind him, reminded him softly, Luo Quan, be careful. Don't belittle him. Especially be careful of his consciousness attack. Consciousness attack? Luo Quan was stunned but suddenly sneered. I fought with him 800 years ago. He used consciousness attacks then too. It didn't affect me at all. Even if he did improve tremendously over the past 800 years, he was so far behind me it won't matter even now. Luo Quan sneered as he walked to the middle of Titanic Star. He stood opposite Jian Wushuang, a large distance away. The moment Luo Quan appeared on the battlefield, his face grew cold, and he put his guard up. It was clear that Hall Master Yuan and the Deacon Elderlies were in agreement that Jian Wushuang was stronger than Lu Han, so it must be true. This point alone showed that Jian Wushuang was not that weak. Although Lu Han wasn't very strong, I'd need to put in time and effort to defeat him. Jian Wushuang is definitely stronger than Lu Han. I can't be careless. I must give my all from the very beginning. Otherwise, I might miss the quota to become a disciple of Star Palace. Luo Quan licked his lips as he fixed his gaze on Jian Wushuang. At the same time, Jian Wushuang was looking at Luo Quan while he sent a message. Qiuyu, are all of you here yet? Yes, mister. All the maid and servants on Sword Star are watching at the border of Titanic Star, Qiuyu replied. All right. Watch the next scene. Don't miss it. Jian Wushuang sounded calm. After he sent the message, he spoke. Luo Quan, you once said that my property as a disciple of Star Palace, my Sword Star, including the maids and servants under my command, would become yours after this battle. Now I am standing before you. Defeat me, and you will naturally get everything that you wanted. You think I can't? Luo Quan sneered. 800 years ago, You were once defeated by me. This time, you'll be decimated. The moment Luo Quan said that, he suddenly charged forward like a raging beast. He was wearing a pair of crimson gloves on his hand, and they were giving out a bold scarlet light. Suddenly, Luo Quan appeared before Jian Wushuang. There was an ancient roar reverberating as his right hand curled into a fist and transformed into a ferocious beast. It was plunging at Jian Wushuang with a terrifying force. Looking at the attack that Luo Quan had pulled, the surrounding disciples looked shocked. Jian Wushuang still isn't taking action. What is he doing standing there? Hurry up and block the attack. The disciples started panicking on behalf of Jian Wushuang, but he didn't even move an inch. It was almost as though he was scared stiff. However, just as the beast transformed from the crimson fist descending on Jian Wushuang, he suddenly lifted his head, and there was an intense crimson light that erupted. The crimson light was just like a scarlet sun. It was blinding, yet eye-catching. Everyone couldn't help but be attracted by the scarlet sun, and Luo Quan was the first to bear the brunt of it. It was a consciousness attack secret skill by Real God Demonic Rain on Real God Ranking List, 18 Azura Hell, which was performed by Jian Wushuang, who possessed soul power, that was at the level of peak universe God in the third heaven. Ah! A shrill scream was heard across Titanic Star. The ferocious beast that had transformed from the fist dispersed straight away, but left Luo Quan alone, bellowing like a madman. His face was distorted and red with agony. The veins on his forehead and arms popped. He looked ferocious. His eyes were bloodshot too. He waved his hands desperately as an enormous amount of divine power splashed out, but it didn't reach Jian Wushuang at all. He continued to bellow. No! No! Stop, quick stop! Ah! Hurry up and stop! The entire Titanic Star and the entire boundless Milky Way were shaken by the shrill, mad bellow. The surrounding disciples on Titanic Star were shocked at the sight. What happened to him? Chapter 1404. Amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. Chapter 1404. Amaze the world with a single brilliant feat. At the border of Titanic Star, all the disciples were dumbfounded. They were all shocked. Everyone's gaze was fixed on Luo Quan as Luo Quan's pathetic roar reverberated in their ears. Phantasmagoria, it's Phantasmagoria! One of the disciples shouted. Suddenly, everyone understood. Looking at the sight before their eyes, Luo Quan was obviously in Jian Wushuang's Phantasmagoria. He couldn't shake it off, he couldn't free himself from it. He could only suffer under the effect of the Phantasmagoria. Such a scary Phantasmagoria. Even Luo Quan couldn't shake it off. What did he go into the Phantasmagoria? How could he be in so much pain? The surrounding disciples were terrified. What they didn't know was that the reason the 18 Azura Hell, that Real God Demonic Rain, created was to torture. It was a method to torture one's consciousness. 18 Azura Hell had 18 floors of dreamland in total. Every floor was a phantasmagoria of suffering. Jian Wushuang was performing the first 6 floors. Luo Quan drowned in the 6 floors of phantasmagoria, and he was naturally suffering. No. His pathetic groans continued, but suddenly, it was as though Luo Quan's tongue was removed. His words were blocked, and they could barely hear noises from his nose. He seemed to be saying, "Let me live, please. Show mercy. Let me go, please. Let me go." That sight struck up terror. The disciples were imagining just how scary the phantasmagoria was making Luo Quan beg for mercy. In the Milky Way, Hall Master Yuan and the other 10 deacon elderlies stood side by side as they watched the sight before them. Even the deacon elderlies were shocked. Previously in the Supreme Tower, his consciousness attack couldn't be performed as he was fighting against a war puppet. Now that he is facing a human cultivator, he could put many tricks to play. Just the phantasmagoria that he showed currently is impressive enough. True, Luo Quan is a genius disciple in the lineage of Star. He has high hopes of entering Star Palace. Although he isn't as good at consciousness, he is at least at the level of an advanced universe god in the third heaven. But he begged for mercy in the phantasmagoria that Jian Wushuang put him in. To be able to do so, not only would it require Jian Wushuang to have a stronger consciousness than he does, but it also requires a terrifying dreamland technique. I'm curious about what Luo Quan went through in the dreamland. The deacon elderlies converse casually. As dreamland was only aimed at one single person, only that particular person could experience the phantasmagoria in the dreamland. The others could only see Luo Quan in agony. He looked like he was suffering, but no one knew what he was going through in the dreamland. On Titanic Star, the disciples saw Luo Quan in pain and everyone gulped. Xu Yang, who was in the crowd, was terrified too. I already reminded Luo Quan to be careful of Jian Wushuang's consciousness attack, but in the end he still failed. Xu Yang shook his head and sighed. Back when he had met Jian Wushuang in the Milky Way, he had fought with Jian Wushuang, and he taught him a lesson. Hence, in the entire lineage of Star, only he knew that Jian Wushuang's power wasn't as weak as it looked, especially his consciousness attack. Hence, he had especially reminded Luo Quan earlier. However, even with his reminder, Luo Quan still fell into Jian Wushuang's dreamland and was unable to free himself from it. On the other side, Lu Han's face grew grave. He finally knew why Hall Master Yuan and the other deacon elderlies had agreed that Jian Wushuang was stronger than him. Even Luo Quan couldn't withstand it and got struck by the phantasmagoria. If it was him, he would not be able to fight back either. Am I leaving lineage of Star? Lu Han felt bitter. In the middle of the battlefield, the veins on Luo Quan's forehead and arms all popped up. He looked extremely ferocious. He was still in the dreamland, and he was suffering on the third floor of Dreamland, Ironwood Hell. Jian Wushuang was standing there with a cold expression. Xiaoyu, did you see that? Jian Wushuang asked. Yes, we saw, mister. We saw. There was an obvious excitement in Xiaoyu's voice. That will do. Jian Wushuang nodded faintly. He was too lazy to take another look at Luo Quan, but he looked at the deacon elderly, who was the host for the rotation battle. Can you announce the result? The deacon elderly was stunned, but immediately responded. I announced that in this battle Jian Wushuang is the winner. The deacon elderly announced the result straight away. Of course, even if he didn't, everyone at the scene could tell. Luo Quan's consciousness was drowning in the dreamland. He couldn't shake it off. If Jian Wushuang were to take action then, he could have killed Luo Quan easily. Jian Wushuang turned around and walked to the back after the announcement. Jian Wushuang, Luo Quan's phantasmagoria. The deacon elderly couldn't help but say. Soon, he will come back to reality, Jian Wushuang said and left without turning back. As expected, Luo Quan, who went through the 6 floors of Dreamland, slowly recovered. However, even though his consciousness had recovered, he was still terrified. Jian Wushuang. Luo Quan stared at Jian Wushuang, but there wasn't any sort of denial. There was only terror. No one knew how much indescribable torture he had gone through in the dreamland in a short period of time. The suffering was so real that he would never forget it for the rest of his life. It was the scariest dreamland he had encountered since he had started cultivation. He definitely didn't want to experience such a dreamland a second time. Hence, he naturally didn't dare to provoke Jian Wushuang again. He could only move back with some help from 2 other disciples. In the first battle, in the rotation battle, Jian Wushuang had won. The result naturally shocked the surrounding disciples. Jian Wushuang defeated Luo Quan. He didn't even move an inch. He only performed a dreamland technique and defeated Luo Quan. He was totally thrashed. How could it be? Isn't Jian Wushuang always weak? 800 years ago, when he first came to the lineage of Star, any ordinary disciple could easily have trampled him. Jian Wushuang improved tremendously in the past 800 years. His power increased so significantly, but he never shows off. Even when all of us doubted his power and thought he wasn't qualified to become a disciple of Star Palace, he never explained himself. During this battle, he proved himself to us with his power. His patience and endurance is next level. Amazing the world with a single brilliant feat. Jian Wushuang impressive. Chapter 1405, Rotation Battle. Chapter 1405, Rotation Battle. If the disciples had been in doubt of Jian Wushuang's power, and thought he wasn't qualified to be a disciple of Star Palace. The doubts had definitely vanished after the battle between him and Luo Quan. Since the very beginning, Jian Wushuang had never once made an explanation. But he proved himself with absolute power during the battle. From that day on, in lineage of Star, there wouldn't be anyone who was in doubt of his ability as a disciple of Star Palace. Then the rotation battles continued. Jian Wushuang returned outside Titanic Star and watched quietly as he recovered his soul power. Very soon his second rotation battle began. The next battle will be Jian Wushuang versus Xiao Yu. The Deacon Elderly's voice reverberated on Titanic Star. Jian Wushuang and Xiao Yu, who were both called upon, walked forward. The two of them stood opposite one another in the distance. Xiao Yu was just an ordinary disciple, and she was weaker in power compared to Luo Quan. If there wasn't any accident during the battle, there wouldn't be any suspense. Jian Wushuang, perform the trick that you used on Luo Quan. Xiao Yu looked solemn as she stared at Jian Wushuang. Although she was extremely astonished by the sight of Jian Wushuang defeating Luo Quan, the phantasm that Jian Wushuang performed instilled fear in Xiao Yu. However, she was afraid of Jian Wushuang's phantasm only. As for the other attacks, she believed that Jian Wushuang wouldn't be her match. As long as I can endure his phantasmagoria images and shake off his dreamland, I will win the battle. Xiao Yu clenched her fists. When Jian Wushuang heard her, he shook his head and said, I don't need to pull that trick when I'm against you. Are you humiliating me? Xiao Yu got furious. Let's see what you have. Swoosh. Xiao Yu took action directly. She had a purple long spear in her hand. The moment the purple long spear appeared, there was an explosion of huge power immediately. Swoosh. The long spear turned into a bunch of crimson-purple rays. It pierced the void and appeared before Jian Wushuang. It had yet to reach Jian Wushuang, and he could feel the terrifying, spiraling force that the tip of the long spear had brought about. Jian Wushuang didn't look like he had moved much, but just as the purple long spear was about to stab his body, vroom! A vast expanse of soul power suddenly soared, and immediately formed into a huge black tortoise on the surface of Jian Wushuang's body. The purple long spear stabbed the black tortoise shell, and there was a loud clash, but it didn't move an inch. What? Xiao Yu was shocked. Just then, Jian Wushuang saw a ray of sharp light. Roar! 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 3 roars were heard simultaneously. Suddenly, 3 huge demonic dragons transformed from the billowing soul power on Titanic Star. The 3 demonic dragons were pitch black, and they gave out fierce aura. It was as though they came from a borderless hell, and they flew out like lightning. The 3 demonic dragons charged towards Xiao Yu in unison. The strong, imposing aura that the demonic dragons brought along frightened Xiao Yu. She could feel that with one of the dragons would be extremely difficult to fight off, let alone the fact that there were 3 in total then. Go away! Xiao Yu screamed and wielded the purple long spear in her hand. The eruption of her divine power suddenly became 3 strikes of lightning. They suddenly flew at the skulls of 3 demonic dragons. However, the 3 demonic dragons were moving flexibly in the void, and they dodged Xiao Yu's long spear easily. They are so flexible. Xiao Yu was terrified. The very next moment, the 3 demonic dragons appeared next to her and started tearing at her. Xiao Yu didn't endure long before she was defeated. In the boundless Milky Way, the Deacon Elderlies laughed at the sight. Just as we expected, Jian Wushuang didn't give his all in the Supreme Tower. Yeah, for instance, he only put 1 demonic dragon into play when he was in Supreme Tower. The demonic dragon could barely be evenly matched with an ordinary advanced universe god in the 3rd heaven. He put 3 dragons to play at one goal, and it is only natural that Xiao Yu couldn't fight against them. Xiao Yu intended to make Jian Wushuang perform the phantasmagoria trick that he used against Luo Quan. But in the end, Jian Wushuang defeated her with just his consciousness manipulation method alone. Jian Wushuang defeated Xiao Yu, and it was within everyone's expectations. Everyone accepted the result easily. But their fight still shocked many disciples. However, when he fought against Xiao Yu, he didn't even use any secret skills. He won merely with the manipulation of consciousness. It was obvious that Jian Wushuang knew more than just pulling one into dreamland. The rotation battles were rather ferocious. Everyone had to go through 9 battles. At the beginning, Jian Wushuan only fought against ordinary disciples like Luo Quan and Xiao Yu. They were hardly any troubler for Jian Wushuang. However, his third opponent was a disciple of Star Palace. The next battle will be Jian Wushuang versus Xiaofeng. On Titanic Star, Jian Wushuang and Xiaofeng stood opposite one another. Xiaofeng was in a crimson robe. Although he looked young, he had silver-white hair. Then Xiaofeng looked at Jian Wushuang. I heard that you gave my people a lesson on Tai Yuan Star. Yes, Jian Wushuang nodded, making no attempt at denial. Those were just servants. I had nothing to do with them. They behaved wrongly, and you, as a disciple of Star Palace, took action to give them a lesson. It is only right and proper. I don't mind. However, I will not let you win against me in today's fight, Xiaofeng said. Then we shall see if you have the power to, Jian Wushuang replied coldly. I'll let you know, Xiaofeng smiled. Jian Wushuang, I know your consciousness attack is very powerful, especially your dreamland. However, I am different from Luo Quan and Xiao Yu. They are only ordinary disciples. They never once had a chance to enter Reset Palace to train their consciousness. But I trained for a very long time in Reset Palace. My consciousness strength already reached the level of an advanced universe god in the third heaven. I am only one step away from a peak universe god in the third heaven. Can your dreamland do anything to me? There's only one way to find out. Jian Wushuang didn't say much, but flipped his palm and Blood Mountain sword appeared in his hand. Xiaofeng too took out his divine weapon. It was a pair of gold shackles that looked extremely heavy, and the aura it gave out was rather fierce too. It begins. Xiaofeng smiled, and in the next moment his body shook, and he plunged towards Jian Wushuang at a ghostly speed. Jian Wushuang's eyes were like blazing fires. The moment he saw Xiaofeng move, vast soul power swept out, and suddenly transformed into 3 huge demonic dragons again. Chapter 1406, 8 wins out of 8. Chapter 1406, 8 wins out of 8. Looking at the 3 demonic dragons, the surrounding disciples were shocked. Jian Wushuang defeated Xiao Yu with the 3 demonic dragons. But then, the opponent of the 3 demonic dragons was Xiaofeng, who was much stronger than Xiao Yu. Humph! Xiaofeng humped, and then the gold maces in his hands gave out a resplendent golden light. The 2 gold maces went through the void like lightning, and reappeared above the 3 demonic dragons' skulls. Thud! 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 The 3 continuous, low thuds were heard and a fierce divine power exploded. The 3 demonic dragons' skull broke, and an enormous amount of soul power dispersed. Xiaofeng moved and appeared before Jian Wushuang. He slammed down the 2 gold maces without pulling any funny business. Jian Wushuang squinted his eyes but didn't dodge. The black tortoise shell on the surface of his body gave out a sharp brightness. Dang! Dang! The gold mace hit the shell, and the huge black tortoise vibrated vigorously, but it didn't show any sign that it was going to collapse. This shell is quite sturdy, huh? Xiaofeng complimented, but suddenly, there was a surge of golden light from his body. There was originally just 2 arms, but suddenly there were another 2 muscular arms that popped up. Now he had 4 arms in total, and every arm held a gold mace. Break! Xiaofeng roared, and the 4 arms waved together. The 4 gold mace carried great power, and slammed down on the tortoise shell like lightning. Bang! 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 There was loud clashing sound that rang continuously. The gold mace hit the tortoise shell over and over again, and every time the shell would vibrate vigorously. As the number of times the gold mace hit the tortoise shell grew, the entire black tortoise started trembling in the balance. Xiaofeng was obviously much stronger than Xiao Yu. He lives up to his identity as a disciple of Star Palace. Jian Wushuang complimented. Then he suddenly lifted his head. Xiaofeng, didn't you want to experience my dreamland technique? Let me fulfill your request. As Jian Wushuang spoke, there was a flash of crimson light that spurted from his eyes. The crimson light was like a huge crimson sun. It was so eye-catching that everyone in the area couldn't help but look over. Xiaofeng naturally looked towards the crimson sun as well. Suddenly, the surrounding image churned, and he came to the first floor of the borderless hell. It's dreamland. Break. Break it. Xiaofeng roared, and his consciousness in the sea of consciousness surged in madness. He wanted to shake off the dreamland. But at that very moment, Jian Wushuang, who was protected by the black tortoise, suddenly charged forward and wielded Blood Mountain sword. Break! Xiaofeng's entire body was straining with anger. With his fierce and determined consciousness, he finally came back to reality from the dreamland. I'm out! Xiaofeng just revealed his joyous expression, and suddenly a chilly sword gleam continuously grew in his eyes. Too close. The distance was too close. When he realized, it was already too late for him to avoid any tricks. Swoosh! The sword light stopped 1 centimeter before his throat. Then a cold voice was heard. Xiaofeng, you lost. The voice was cold and expressionless, but it sounded like a heavy explosion to Xiaofeng's ears. How could it be? Xiaofeng shivered, and he was dissatisfied. After all, he had already freed himself from the dreamland, but in the end he still lost. Just a little, just that little. If I were to shake the dreamland off slightly earlier, I would be able to block his sword in time. Xiaofeng mumbled to himself, but he had already seen the reason as to why he had lost to Jian Wushuang. At the end of the day, it was because his consciousness was slightly weaker. Hence, he couldn't shake off the dreamland earlier. After all, Jian Wushuang could totally take action the moment he fell into dreamland. However, although he shook off the dreamland, he was slower in speed to the extent that he couldn't block Jian Wushuang's sword in time. Jian Wushuang. Xiaofeng lifted his head and looked at Jian Wushuang. Your consciousness and the dreamland attack are really powerful. No wonder you could win against Luo Quan so easily. The other 8 disciples in the second rotation battle wouldn't be able to resist that, besides Ling Fei Bai. Even if they could free themselves from the dreamland, they wouldn't be able to block your sword. As for Ling Fei Bai, his strength of consciousness reached the level of a peak universe god in the 3rd heaven long ago. With your magic alone, it would be impossible for you to take him. Oh, Jian Wushuang raised his eyebrows. All right, let's announce the results. Xiaofeng looked at the deacon elderly by his side. The deacon elderly immediately announced the result. The one who had won the battle was Jian Wushuang. However, even though Jian Wushuang had won, many disciples felt that it was a pity for Xiaofeng, because Xiaofeng had freed himself from the dreamland. It was merely because he was slightly slower that he couldn't block Jian Wushuang's sword in time. Otherwise, no one would have been able to tell who would win the battle. Above the boundless Milky Way, even Xiaofeng lost to Jian Wushuang. It seems that the only one who could defeat him in the rotation battle is Ling Fei Bai. Tsk tisk. It's a pity, but it's not definite. I feel that Jian Wushuang still has my trump cards hidden in his pocket. I think so too. Haha, let's continue to watch. The deacon elderlies chatted amongst themselves casually. They were in a good mood. They were glad to see the disciples under them fight vigorously. On Titanic Star, the rotation battle continued. The rest of the battle was just as Xiaofeng had said. There was no one from the rest of the disciples who could resist Jian Wushuang's dreamland, besides Ling Baifei. Even if they resisted and shook it off, they couldn't block Jian Wushuang's sword in time. In the end, they could only be defeated by Jian Wushuang, one after another. The time flew by. After half a day, the rotation battle came to an end. By that time, Jian Wushuang had already been through 8 out of 9 battles. In the 8 battles he had fought against 8 disciples. The result was 8 wins out of 8, and there was only one left. The opponent for his last battle was similarly a genius that had experienced 8 wins out of 8. His name was Ling Fei Bai. Lineage of Star. The battle among disciples who were universe gods in the 2nd heaven. The last rotation battle would be between the strongest 2. Chapter 1407. The battle between the strongest 2. Chapter 1407. The battle between the strongest 2. The battle between the strongest 2 is finally coming. Many disciples around the vast galaxy were excited. Even the elderly deacons were looking forward to it. Guess who will win the next battle? A woman in a green robe said. Definitely Ling Feibai, but it's uncertain how many difficulties Jian Wushuang can bring to him. A strong man said. Indeed, Ling Feibai is much stronger than other disciples, including the disciples of the Star Palace. Although Jian Wushuang had an excellent performance, he still cannot rival Ling Feibai. But he will pose great challenges for Ling Feibai. Exactly. The elderly deacons chatted and laughed casually. In the crowd, the hall master Yuan and Lei Chao looked at each other face to face, and both of them could read each other's minds. In addition to the Supreme Palace Master, only they knew the secret of Jian Wushuang. He was just a universe god in the first heaven. It was already remarkable for a universe god in the first heaven to have had such a great performance. It would be surprising if Jian Wushuang could win the second round of the battle. What's more, it would be a miracle for a universe god in the first heaven to win the battle and keep the position of the disciples in the Star Palace. But now Jian Wushuang had not only made a miracle, he was also competing with Ling Feibai, the most excellent universe god in the second heaven. This was far beyond their expectations. No one could stay calm if they heard that a universe god in the first heaven could rival the top universe god in the second heaven in the Star Palace. We still don't know how much he can surprise us, the Hall Master Yuan said excitedly, watching Jian Wushuang's battle. Jian Wushuang was now standing face to face with Ling Feibai on the Star Land. I thought it would be Xiafeng or Moze who would come to the final round to battle with me, but I never expected you. Ling Feibai looked at Jian Wushuang with a gentle smile. But I expected it. Jian Wushuang smiled. Ling Feibai showed his contempt. I know you are good at consciousness attacks and phantasmagoria, but that means nothing to me. Come on, show me all your power. Ling Feibai said. He stood there confidently. Don't worry, you won't be disappointed. Jian Wushuang said. Jian Wushuang started to generate power. As he blinked his eyes a little, a scarlet halo burst out. 18 Azura Hell again. That's another 18 Azura Hell. It is the phantasmagoria from Jian Wushuang. He was using such powerful skills so early. Many disciples watching the battle could not help but tighten their hands. Jian Wushuang had used this phantasmagoria several times in the battle, and no one could resist it. Even the genius Xiafeng and Moze couldn't resist this phantasmagoria from Jian Wushuang. With this tactic, Jian Wushuang defeated the other 8 disciples. Now facing Ling Feibai, the strongest universe god in the second heaven, Jian Wushuang decided to use his skills right at the beginning. The 18 Azura Hell started to come into play, and meanwhile, Jian Wushuang started to wave his sword. His swordsmanship was as quick and violent as a blazing flint. He had created it during the 90-year cultivation in the Longgang Mystery Land. This swordsmanship was called the Fire Light. Buzz! Ling Feibai at first felt surprised about the attack, but soon he calmed down. It's a good skill, but it still won't affect me. Ling Feibai laughed. Jian Wushuang was shocked. Even geniuses like Xiafeng and Moze struggled to resist my phantasmagoria, but Ling Feibai isn't affected at all. At that moment, Jian Wushuang saw that Ling Feibai wave a purple soft sword. You are good at swordsmanship, so am I. Ling Feibai said. The purple sword began to generate power. It collided with Jian Wushuang's sword, causing tremendous sparks. Bang! Jian Wushuang suffered a great backlash while Ling Feibai remained unaffected. Then Jian Wushuang started to generate his black tortoise to block the attack of the purple sword light. But the black tortoise's power dissipated quickly under the attack, and Jian Wushuang was forced to retreat instantly. Your defense is not bad. But I haven't shown my true power. Then Ling Feibai's eyes turned bright and purple. He generated another sword light again, of the same size as the previous one. But it was much more powerful and much faster. Jian Wushuang generated his soul power to form 3 demonic dragons that rushed to Ling Feibai. The purple sword light pierced 3 demonic dragons in an instant, and then bombarded the black tortoise again. Bang! This time, the giant black tortoises totally collapsed. Jian Wushuang himself was also attacked. The attack is so strong. Jian Wushuang was shocked by Ling Feibai's great power. Why can a universe god in the second heaven break both my black tortoise and the demonic dragon? His swordsmanship is extremely excellent. Besides, his divine power is extremely powerful. It is absolutely comparable to an ordinary universe god in the third heaven. King of Venomous Worms said to Jian Wushuang, "As far as I know, he may have combined 3 strongest sword principles just as you did. He is as powerful as a universe god in the third heaven." Chapter 1408 Gold Divine Ape. Chapter 1408 Gold Divine Ape. 3 strongest sword principle? Isn't that the same as me? Jian Wushuang was shocked. He became universe god because he had merged 3 strongest sword principles. Hence, his explosion of divine power was stronger by 100 times than those at the same rank. Although Ling Feibai wasn't an inverse cultivator, if he were to really become universe god because he merged 3 strongest sword principle, his explosion of divine power would still be dozens of times stronger than those at the same rank. In other words, as a universe god in the second heaven, he could be evenly matched with an advanced universe god in the third heaven, in terms of the explosion of divine power. On top of that, including the secret skill that he had cultivated, treasures that he possessed and unique skill that he had created. No wonder he could be evenly matched with a peak universe god in the third heaven 1,000 years ago. Now that 1,000 years had passed, he must be even stronger. Jian Wushuang was shocked. With such a strong power, it seems that if I don't perform any tricks, I might not even qualify to be his opponent. I'd better give it my all. Jian Wushuang's eyes were twinkling with brightness. A tremendous momentum of soul power surged the very next moment. The level of soul power was much higher than when he pulled off soul attack earlier. Vroom vroom vroom. His soul power churned in madness, and it became a huge, gold divine ape that was more than 300 meters tall before all the disciples. There was golden light spurting out from the divine ape's eyes. The moment it appeared, it bellowed in anger. Its roar shook heaven and earth, and its imposing force spread in all directions. Suddenly the universe changed color. Outside of Titanic Star, the disciples who were watching the battle noticed the power that the gold divine ape gave out. They looked frightened. Above the boundless Milky Way, the deacon elderlies too were shocked. That's divine ape? First black tortoise, then demonic dragon. Now even the strongest divine ape appeared. Could the manipulation method of consciousness that Jian Wushuang cultivated be 5 beast soul manipulation knack? Yes, definitely. Black tortoise, demonic dragon and divine ape are exactly the same. As for purple tiger and crimson phoenix, he has never performed it yet. This young man possesses such a profound manipulation method of soul. Those deacon elderlies were experienced. Previously, when there was only demonic dragon and black tortoise, they let it be. Then when the divine ape appeared, they immediately recognized the origin of the 5 beast soul manipulation knack. Of course, they could recognize that, but they couldn't tell that Jian Wushuang had been using soul power, not consciousness. The 5 beast soul manipulation knack, I gave it to him. Hall Master Yuan suddenly said. The surrounding deacon elderlies looked towards Hall Master Yuan. This young man is very good at consciousness attacks. However, he was inexperienced in the manipulation of consciousness. So I told Lei Chao to get the 5 beast soul manipulation knack for him. Of course, I didn't just give it to him. He paid a huge price for it. Hall Master Yuan smiled. The price that he was referring to was actually the fact that Jian Wushuang had to pretend to be a universe god in the second heaven and received unfair treatment in Lineage of Star. Hearing Hall Master Yuan's explanation, the deacon elderlies understood. TSK, to be able to perform divine ape, not only represents that Jian Wushuang's consciousness has reached the level of a peak universe god in the third heaven, but it also meant that he already reached the level of great achievement in the mastery of 5 beast soul manipulation knack. Now that divine ape is out, he could definitely be evenly matched with a peak universe god in the third heaven in terms of power. From what it seems, it won't be too easy for Ling Feibai to win first place in this rotation battle. A deacon elderly sighed. On Titanic Star, the gold divine ape that was 300 meters tall appeared in the universe, while Jian Wushuang stood right in the middle of the gold divine ape with his faint gold eyes. He fixed his gaze at Ling Baifei before him. There was a surge of murderous intention that soared up. This is fun. There was a flash of light twinkling in Ling Feibai's eyes too. The very next moment, he moved and appeared before the gold divine ape. He wielded the purple soft sword in his hand. A ray of purple sword light shot out, and the power and size continuously increased during the process when it swept across the void. It finally reached the gold divine ape. Looking at the approaching purple sword light, Jian Wushuang, who was in the gold divine ape, held Blood Mountain sword and swung. Along with the swing, there was a gold sword that appeared in the gold divine ape's hand. It then imitated Jian Wushuang's action. Bang! A terrifying gold sword light collided with the long purple sword shadow. After a shocking clash, the two sword lights dispersed. Oh! Ling Feibai raised his eyebrows and smirked. Not bad. In terms of power, it's not weaker than a peak universe god in the third heaven that I once fought. I wonder how the other aspects are too. Swoosh! Ling Feibai plunged forward. As he was charging forward, a boundless purple mist began spreading. Meteor shower. Wah! In the purple mist, the rays of purple sword light were like meteorites. They showered down towards the gold divine ape's body. So fast. Jian Wushuang revealed a face of terror, and he quickly waved his sword to block the purple sword light. However, it was impossible for the gold divine ape's huge body to block off those fine meteor-like purple sword light. It most likely only blocked 1/3 of them. The rest of the 2/3 of the sword lights hit the gold divine ape's huge body, unfiltered. Swoosh, 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 swoosh. Some parts of the divine ape's body were pierced by purple sword lights, and there were holes all over. However, these holes were filled back instantly by soul power. Hence, the gold divine ape wasn't affected at all. A divine ape formed by consciousness. Even when it was pierced, it could recover immediately. Ling Feibai squinted his eyes and then smiled. How about this then? Swoosh! Ling Feibai's body suddenly moved and appeared by the side of the gold divine ape. He swung his purple soft sword. The sword light wasn't hindered and instantly penetrated the gold divine ape's throat. The gold divine ape's huge skull then flew off. However, although the gold divine ape was cut off, it was only a short while before it recovered. The skull could be recovered too. Ling Feibai creased his eyebrows. Then he quickly loosened them again. Although it could be recovered, it would require an enormous amount of consciousness. Although your consciousness is strong, how long could you stand for if you kept using it? Ling Feibai's voice spread and Jian Wushuang, who was in the gold divine ape, suddenly felt strange. Chapter 1409. Jian Wushuang did all he could. Chapter 1409. Jian Wushuang did all he could. On the Titanic Star. Whiz! 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 The ghostly figure of Ling Feibai shuttled through the void, and his existence could not be seen easily. Jian Wushuang could barely detect Ling Feibai's fast movements with his soul power. It was so fast that Jian Wushuang couldn't spare more effort to deal with Ling Feibai's further attack. Ling Feibai, while shuttling through the void, continued to operate his swordsmanship to penetrate the golden divine ape generated by Jian Wushuang, or cut the ape's arms or head. Although Jian Wushuang could immediately restore the golden god ape with his soul power, it really exhausted his energy. I have to find a way to limit his power. Jian Wushuang blinked his eyes, turned his palms, and generated his blaze quicksand gourd. The quicksand of the gourd rushed out immediately. In an instant, the sand covered the whole vast Titanic Star, surrounding Ling Feibai, and causing great difficulties to him. You want to limit my power with only this? Ling Feibai grinned. More than that, Jian Wushuang shouted with a loud cry as a huge, scarlet fire burst out around his divine body, forming a scarlet sea of fire in a vast area around him. He now dominated the sea. Scarlet Kingdom, another secret skill. He used the secret skill from the Scarlet Island. At the beginning, he could only perform the first part of the secret skill, with his overall strength improved by 70%. Now he could display the second part. Now with the skill, his overall strength has doubled. Blaze Quicksand Gourd weakened Ling Feibai's power, while Scarlet Kingdom improved Jian Wushuang's. Now Jian Wushuang's power almost matched his rivals. Seeing this scene, Ling Feibai thought, "You truly have many means, but unfortunately, they are useless." Then, Ling Fei generated a large number of waves, covering the entire Titanic star. The waves formed a domain and at the same time, competed with Jian Wushuang's sand domain for dominance. But perhaps Ling Feibai's strength was stronger, Jian Wushuang's sand domain was suppressed and retreated. He also has a domain treasure, Jian Wushuang thought. It was easy to understand. After all, Ling Feibai was the genius in the lineage of star for so many years. It was normal to get some treasures after numerous adventures. Without the suppression of Jian Wushuang quicksand, Ling Feibai's power exploded, making Jian Wushuang feel pain and exhausting his soul power at an astonishing speed. The exertion of the ape alone has made my soul's strength extremely low. Now the Ling Feibai dependence is constantly harming the ape, and I have to constantly repair it. This consumes more of the soul's strength. It won't take long for my soul's strength to be exhausted. In every battle, participants always had a certain time to restore their divine power and soul power, and Jian Wushuang had also remaining at his peak. Nevertheless, with his current soul power, he could not use the divine ape for too long. I have to spare no effort before the power is exhausted. It would be good if I could defeat Ling Feibai. If not, I will give in. Jian Wushuang had already made the decision. He used his final skill, a black mysterious spear. It was this peculiar spear that helped him kill Bei Xiao. The god-killing spear? Consciousness attacks treasures. And it seems that it is a high-level treasure. Deacons found it how remarkable the treasure was. Ling Feibai, you have to be careful. Jian Wushuang kindly reminded him. And then the dark, mysterious spear slowly floated up, appearing in the hands of the golden divine ape, whose power exploded. Ling Feibai was a little surprised. With my remaining soul power and divine power, I can still make 2 attacks. There you go. Jian Wushuang clenched his hands, and a flash of light burst out. Secret skill of Tian Yuan. Bang! The first part, the secret skill of Tian Yuan, was inextinguishable light. And the second, eternal light. He hadn't been able to use the eternal light until his power reached the peak of a universe god in the 3rd heaven, after cultivation, for 800 years. Eternal light was 100 times stronger than inextinguishable light. And while the eternal light burst out, the golden ape, 100 feet tall, let out its power with a roar. Then, as the ape threw the god-killing spear in his hand directly, the eternal light instantly integrated into the spear. The eternal light got even more power when it was integrated with the spear. Feeling alarmed, Ling Feibai waved his purple sword. Sunset firmament. Boom! The disciples who had been watching the battle were all astonished by the great power. The deacons could recognize that the skill was a rank 3 unique skill. Lei Feibai's sword and Jian Wushuang's spear collided with each other. Bang! The spear blasted out, and the golden divine ape also nearly broke down. The eternal light of the spear also went into the consciousness sea in Ling Feibai's divine body. His face went pale. As for Jian Wushuang, without the protection of the golden divine ape or the black tortoise, he was directly blasted out. Chapter 1410, Victory or Defeat. Chapter 1410, Victory or Defeat. Ling Feibai lifted his head, and happened to see the crimson sun twinkling in Jian Wushuang's eyes that was charging towards him. Dreamland again. I told you it won't affect me. Ling Feibai roared, and his fierce consciousness charged. He shook off the dreamland instantly. Of course, although he had freed himself from the dreamland, it required some time for it to happen. At that moment, Jian Wushuang's eyes were twinkling with unprecedented light. I knew that it wouldn't be of any harm to you, but as long as it affected you by a slight amount, it would be enough. Jian Wushuang's roar reverberated in the entire Milky Way. Before the surrounding disciples' gazes, Jian Wushuang, who was close to Ling Feibai, gathered the churning divine power in his body all into his right index finger. The very next moment, the index finger that had gathered boundless divine power spurted gold brilliant light. Fourth finger of ancient god, God's test. Rumble. He pointed and the earth shattered. The entire Milky Way darkened. Among the boundless darkness, a huge bronze finger that seemed to extend over from the remote ages appeared. The huge bronze finger brought about an imposing force that could destroy the world. When it appeared, every disciple's face grew pale. Even the deacon elderlies among the Milky Way were shocked by the sight. Bloodline power. Jian Wushuang has such a strong bloodline. This kind of bloodline should be an ancient god's bloodline, right? Ancient god was definitely the utmost supreme bloodline in eternal chaotic world. The ferocity of ancient god was well understood by the deacon elderlies. Then, Jian Wushuang relied on his ancient god power to put his ancient god unique skill into full play, which was the fourth finger of ancient god. He had acquired the technique of the fourth finger after he had become a universe god in the first heaven and awakened again to inherit the memory. Only ancient gods above 5-star were qualified to perform that technique. Even Jian Wushuang barely performed it. However, he amazed the world with the single feat. Rumble. The bronze huge finger charged towards Ling Feibai. A terrifying manner suppressed the air, and Ling Feibai was shocked. He had just freed himself from Jian Wushuang's dreamland, and he had to deal with such a terrifying technique. Naturally, he was slightly slow in response. He couldn't dodge in time, but he immediately performed a sword principle to break the huge bronze finger apart. Wah! The eye-catching sword light suddenly erupted. Ling Baifei couldn't perform his unique skill in time, and he only swung his sword. It gave out great power, especially a tearing power. Bang! The huge bronze finger collided with the sword light. A loud thud came along with piss. An enormous amount of divine power crushed and crashed. The eye-catching sword light wanted to tear down the huge bronze finger. However, Ling Feibai belittled the power of the fourth finger of ancient god. As it was a supreme unique skill of an ancient god, even though Jian Wushuang concentrated the ancient god power all over his body, he was only just able to perform the technique. If Ling Feibai could perform his unique skill, he would be able to resist or even tear off the huge finger. However, a random swing wouldn't be able to resist the huge bronze finger, let alone to tear it apart. The huge bronze finger gave out strong power and collapsed the sword light like breaking a piece of dead wood. Then the huge finger covered Ling Feibai's body directly. No, Ling Feibai was frightened. Bang! The earth-shattering rumble was heard across Titanic Star, and also the Milky Way. The huge bronze finger erupted its power entirely, and formed a bronze divine storm, while Ling Feibai drowned in it. It ended. Ling Feibai, did he lose? At the border of Titanic Star, the disciples were shocked at the sight. Jian Wushuang stood in the void panting, but his gaze was fixed on the inner part of the divine storm. Just then, rumble! A scary aura suddenly swept out from the divine storm. The aura was extremely fierce, and it broke off from the divine storm easily. What? Jian Wushuang's face changed, and was replaced by a bitter smile. The disciples at the border of Titanic Star were in shock. They saw that after the soaring aura had broken the divine storm, a 3-meter-tall purple god, which was covered with purple scales, and had ferocious features appeared. The purple god held a purple, soft sword in his hand. Although there was a tremendous change in his body, there was no change in his appearance. The purple god was Ling Feibai. Supreme Heaven. Ling Feibai even used Supreme Heaven. It seems like he was cornered. Haha, to be able to force Ling Feibai to this stage is very good. The deacon elderlies were chatting on the Milky Way. They knew that what Ling Feibai was going to do would be his strongest trump card. On Titanic Star, Jian Wushuang stood there calmly with a bitter face. Although the purple god that Ling Feibai transformed into had a soaring aura, his facial expression was one of embarrassment. He looked at Jian Wushuang apologetically. Sorry, I got too excited and used this technique subconsciously. Using this technique in the battle is rather unfair to all the disciples, including you. So, consider me a loser for this battle. The disciples heard what Ling Feibai said, and they were astonished. Ling Feibai admitted defeat. But he won now. Jian Wushuang lifted his head and looked at Ling Feibai. I lost and I can only blame myself for not being powerful enough. Plus, according to the rules of the battle, disciples must refrain from consuming elixirs or performing secret skills of Star Palace. But the secret skill that you performed is secret skill of Star Palace. It should be another secret skill from Scripture Depository, right? Yes, the secret skill is called Supreme Heaven, Ling Feibai nodded. I see, Jian Wushuang said calmly. There are 4 secret skills in Scripture Depository. The secret skill of Star Palace is basic. Any disciple of Star Palace could cultivate that. However, the other 3 secret skills would require one to pass through the 3rd floor of Star Tower in order to qualify to cultivate another one. You are able to cultivate Supreme Heaven, and it must mean that you passed through the 3rd floor of Star Tower. You obtained it with your own power. How's that unfair? So, I am the one who lost this battle. Then, Jian Wushuang looked at the deacon elderly who stood not far away and said, Elderly, please announce the result then. The deacon elderly looked at Hall Master Yuan in the Milky Way. He then made the announcement when he saw Hall Master Yuan nod. Ling Feibai is the winner of this battle. Chapter 14:11, A Sudden Change. Chapter 14:11, A Sudden Change. The deacon announced the results of the battle that Ling Feibai had won. This result, originally within the public's expectations, wouldn't be surprising to the many disciples who had watched the battle. But the result caused a stir. Many disciples began to talk about it. Ling Feibai almost lost. He wouldn't have lost the battle if he hadn't used the skills from the Golden Pavilion. Everyone couldn't help exclaiming about Jian Wushuang's power and skills, which had caused great difficulties to Ling Feibai. The Supreme Heaven that Ling Feibai had used was one of the 4 secret skills of the lineage of Star. Only cultivators reaching the 3rd level of the Stat Tower could learn and use it. Now, among the universe gods of the 2nd Heaven, only Ling Feibai had reached the 3rd level of the Star Tower. It was reasonable and fair to use it in this battle. Jian Wushuang also admitted that Ling Feibai was indeed stronger than himself. I'm looking forward to battling with you next time. Ling Feibai looked at Jian Wushuang. Me too. Jian Wushuang nodded with a smile. Jian Wushuang was quite respectful to Ling Feibai after battling with him, especially when Ling Feibai had voluntarily conceded the battle. He decided to challenge Ling Feibai again, when he improved his skills later. Jian Wushuang and Ling Feibai became good friends. But at that moment, an astonishingly loud sound suddenly burst out. Boom! An astonishing power of destruction, without any forewarning, spread directly all over the endless galaxy. It was accompanied by a resounding roar. What's happening? What's this? Everyone in the Titanic Star raised his head. Hall Master Yuan and the other deacons also raised their heads to see what was happening. Oh! A brilliant, dazzling thunderstorm suddenly came, shocking everyone. This is a god test. Even Hall Master Yuan Palace was shocked. A god test without any signs? And the attack even penetrated the inherently powerful defense system of our lineage of Star. Everyone was shocked and horrified. The thunderstorm crossed all the barriers and struck one figure. The figure was Jian Wushuang. Boom! The dazzling thunder burst apart over the divine body of Jian Wushuang, with a sweeping destructive power. Jian Wushuang stayed unscathed and calm. When the thunder had completely dissipated, Jian Wushuang looked at the sky, feeling surprised. The second god test is coming so early. Unexpectedly fast. Jian Wushuang tightened his hands with worry. In the middle of the galaxy, Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao looked at each other face to face, and they already understood why the thunder had suddenly come. This is a sign of Jian Wushuang's second inverse cultivation god test. The first sign of Jian Wushuang's god test was only a thundercloud. But now the sign of the second test had directly transformed into a thunderstorm. Obviously, the second god test would be way more difficult than the first. At this time, Hall Master Yuan ordered, Jian Wushuang, leave here with me. Everyone else, continue your battles. Then Jian Wushuang left the place with Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao. The disciples and deacons in the Titanic Star were confused without knowing what was going on. Is Jian Wushuang's third god test coming? Many disciples speculated. But they knew that it had nothing to do with them, so they soon continued their battles. After a while, Jian Wushuang arrived at the Crystal Palace with Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao. They started to talk about the god test. Jian Wushuang, the sacred thunder should be the sign of your inverse cultivation test. Hall Master Yuan said. Yes, Jian Wushuang nodded. Oh my god, the mere sign of your god test equals others' inverse cultivation tests. Hall Master Yuan couldn't help exclaiming. Jian Wushuang, how soon will your inverse cultivation test be? Lei Chao asked. 10 years, Jian Wushuang answered. So soon? Both Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao were shocked. After all, ordinary practitioners had a relatively long period of time to prepare for their god test, at least a few hundreds of years, or even thousands of years. But now Jian Wushuang only had 10 years to prepare for his second inverse cultivation test. It's too short indeed, Jian Wushuang agreed. Before his first god test, he was given 120 years to prepare. But now there was only 10 years. On that trajectory, Jian Wushuang's third inverse cultivation test would come directly without any preparation time. It's difficult to prepare in only 10 years. Lei Chao frowned. Indeed, the master of Yuan Dian looked over and said. But fortunately, since you have an amazing performance in the battle, you can get a bonus. Besides, you have passed the 19th level of the illusionary mind C. According to the rules of our lineage of star, you can go to the scripture depository and choose another secret skill to practice. The second secret skill? Jian Wushuang asked. Among the 4 great secret skills, the most famous were secret skills of Star Palace, which were admired by all the disciples in the lineage of Star. But if you wanted to practice the second secret, you needed to meet certain conditions. You needed to break through the 3rd floor of the Star Tower. But only the one who had passed the 3rd level of the Star Tower could cultivate another secret skill. Only Ling Feibai did. Why was Jian Wushuang also eligible to do so? Apart from passing the 3rd level of the Star Tower, the other condition is for a universe god in the 2nd heaven to pass above the 18th level of the illusionary mind C. As you have passed through the 19th level, you are qualified to practice the second secret skill. Hall Master Yuan said. I intended to tell you about it after you finished the battle, but now it's time to let you know. The preparation time is only 10 years. You should get the second secret skill as soon as possible. Chapter 14:12 State of Mind. Chapter 14:12 State of Mind. 10 years is really too short. In such a short period of time, even if you picked a suitable secret skill from the scripture depository, you wouldn't have time to cultivate it. Hall Master Yuan creased his eyebrows. The 4 secret skills in Lineage of Star, every single one of them was impressive. If Jian Wushuang were to cultivate the other secret skills, under the prerequisite of the secret skill of Star Palace, the possibility of passing the inverse cultivation test would definitely increase tremendously. It was a pity that he didn't have enough time. After all, the stronger the secret skill, the tougher it was to cultivate. Just like the few secret skills in scripture depository, no matter how brilliant a genius one was, no one could expect to learn the fundamentals without a dozen years of training. Hence, 10 years wasn't enough. Forget about the secret skills. You can't prepare too many things in 10 years. The most important part is understanding the second inverse cultivation test more, and being mentally prepared. That will heighten the possibility of passing, Lei Chao said. You're right. Hall Master Yuan nodded in agreement. If it were just an ordinary cultivator's god's test, they wouldn't need to be so worried over the fact that they only had 10 years to prepare. The most crucial point was that Jian Wushuang was going through an inverse cultivation test. They weren't familiar with inverse cultivation tests. They didn't know what Jian Wushuang would come across during his second inverse cultivation test. The unknown is always the scariest. Jian Wushuang, you've been through your first inverse cultivation test. Tell us what you have been through during your first inverse cultivation test. We shall help to predict, Hall Master Yuan said. Jian Wushuang immediately described his experience of first inverse cultivation briefly. After that, both Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao both looked terrified. The first inverse cultivator test has a total of 9 sacred thunder, and the very last one was a combination of thunder test, fire test and mind test altogether? Oh my god! The two experts were astonished. Just the very first inverse cultivator test already combined thunder test, fire test and mind time. I really couldn't imagine what you would come across during your second inverse cultivator test. Hall Master Yuan looked at Jian Wushuang. I can't tell either. Lei Chao shook his head, but he beamed with joy and said, we can't tell because we don't really know much about inverse cultivation. We seldom once see people passing inverse cultivation test. However, the palace master is powerful and knowledgeable. Who knows? He might know something about the second inverse cultivation test. Palace master? Hall Master Yuan too was delighted. Palace master of Star Palace, the founder of Lineage of Star, the supreme expert on the top of the pyramid in eternal chaotic world, was an ancient existence who had lived for God knows how long. Such a supreme expert must know more about inverse cultivation than they did. Let me ask Palace Master now. Hall Master Yuan immediately sent an inquiry through the communication token. Soon there was a reply. The Palace Master said that the inverse cultivators are the most unique existences in the eternal chaotic world. It is too rare in the eternal chaotic world. Even he didn't know much about the inverse cultivation test. However, he once talked to another Almighty many years back. The Almighty brought up inverse cultivation, and also the inverse cultivation test. The second inverse cultivation test seems to focus not on the power, but on mind. Hall Master Yuan said. Mind? State of mind? Jian Wushuang's pupils contracted. Isn't it like a mind test then? Lei Chao looked over. Different. Hall Master Yuan shook his head. It's another test aimed at one's mind. However, inverse cultivation tests are much scarier than mind tests. Jian Wushuang looked solemn. State of mind. State of mind and consciousness, they were entirely different. The strength of consciousness constantly improved along with the improvement of cultivator's power. However, state of mind would only improve continuously through life encounters. Some had it smooth sailing all their lives until they reached the top. Even if they were extremely powerful, their state of mind might not be strong. But some people were very weak in strength. Their state of mind was extremely strong, as they'd been through many tough experiences. Jian Wushuang belonged to the latter group. Ever since he had risen up from the ancient world, he encountered countless frustrations and hardships. He struggled again and again on the verge of life and death. Through such situations, he had been strengthened. His heart was so firm and tenacious that it was never shaken. However, he was dealing with an inverse cultivation test after all. He couldn't be definite that his state of mind could pass through the inverse cultivation test. As we know that the second inverse cultivation test focuses on state of mind, we will figure some methods out over the next few training years. Hall Master Yuan squinted and continued. In eternal chaotic world, there are many mystery lands and unique places that could give good training to one's state of mind. You only have 10 years. You don't have to go to those mystery lands, but you can try in this one place. Where? Jian Wushuang looked. Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Hall Master Yuan replied. Dark Phoenix Pavilion is second to Lineage of Star in Star Land. There are many experts, and even real God experts. The one thing lacking was that they didn't have an Almighty in charge. In Dark Phoenix Pavilion, there's a training ground called Mind Cliff. It focuses on training state of mind. It is quite famous on Star Land, even throughout the entire Purple Moon Sanctuary. If you were to train for a few years on Mind Cliff, it should be helpful to you. Mind Cliff. Jian Wushuang nodded. Lineage of Star has always been revered by Dark Phoenix Pavilion. If I were to talk to their pavilion master personally, and send some treasures over, it shouldn't be a problem for you to train for a few years on Mind Cliff, Hall Master Yuan said. If so, sorry for the trouble, Hall Master Yuan. Jian Wushuang expressed his gratitude. No big deal. Plus, you performed well in the battle. Theoretically, you should be granted many things. These are just extras. Consider it the price to pay for Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Hall Master Yuan smiled and instructed again. Lei Chao, you will bring this young man to Dark Phoenix Pavilion personally then. All right, Lei Chao nodded. During the years you are in Dark Phoenix Pavilion, I'll have people clear up Firmament World as a place for you to pass through your inverse cultivation test, Hall Master Yuan said. Firmament World was an independent space. There were no cultivators or living things in it. Although Lineage of Star controlled the world, it was useless normally. If it were to be used as a venue to pass through an inverse cultivation test, it'd be the best option. It was a place cut off from external worlds. Regardless of how great the power and movement Jian Wushuang's inverse cultivation test was, no one would notice. Go ahead. Hall Master Yuan waved. Soon, Jian Wushuang headed to the Dark Phoenix Pavilion with Lei Chao. Chapter 1413, Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Chapter 1413, Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Dark Phoenix Pavilion was well known in the Star Land. The majority of disciples there were female, and only a tiny fraction were male. Jian Wushuang and Lei Chao spent only a few days going through the wormhole before they arrived at the gate of the Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Although Dark Phoenix Pavilion couldn't rival the incomparable majesty of the Lineage of Star, it was also boundless and occupied a huge mountain range. Go and tell your master that we've arrived, Lei Chao said coldly to a guard here. Please wait a moment, my lord. The guard disciple immediately went to inform his master. After just a moment, a graceful woman in purple surrounded by a large number of figures came from the Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Lei Chao, long time no see. The woman stopped in front of Lei Chao and looked straight at him. Hello, Su Ro. Lei Chao also responded. Obviously, they had known each other for a long time. A few days ago, I received a message from Hall Master Yuan. I knew that there would be a real god in the stars and a disciple coming to visit my pavilion. But I didn't expect you to come. So, you seem to value this little guy a lot, huh? The woman looked at Jian Wushuang with great interest. Now you know where I'm coming from. Just take us to the mine cliff. Lei Chao said indifferently. Don't hurry. Su Ro raised his eyebrows and at the same time turned around, saying, Come with me. Lei Chao followed Su Ro and others to the mine cliff immediately. On the way to the mine cliff. Lei Chao, is Su Ro your friend or something? Jian Wushuang asked. Lei Chao nodded slightly. She is the master of Dark Phoenix Pavilion and also a real god. We've made several acquaintances. Okay, Jian Wushuang said. And then Su Ro, who was leading the way ahead, suddenly turned around and asked Jian Wushuang, What's your name? Jian Wushuang. He answered politely. Disciples of the Star Palace? Asked Su Ro. Yes. Oh good. I've long heard that all the disciples in Star Palace are extremely gifted. In my Dark Phoenix Pavilion, there are also many disciples, but they are too proud and always at odds with each other. It brings me a lot of pressure. Now that you are a disciple from the Star Palace, you can help me deal with them and give them a lesson. She smiled softly. Su Ro, we have no time to help you, Lei Chao said. It won't take too long. If he helps me, I can provide me a place in the mine cliff for free in return. How about that? Su Ro smiled. Jian Wushuang didn't know how to respond. Before he replied, Su Ro tried to persuade him. Come with me, my disciples can't wait to see you. She sped up. Jian Wushuang looked at Lei Chao for help. Lei Chao frowned and whispered, Jian Wushuang, I owed her a favor. And this is Dark Phoenix Pavilion. I can't refuse her. Just follow her. It won't take long. Fine. Jian Wushuang followed Su Ro. Soon they arrived at a battlefield. This was the place where the Dark Phoenix Pavilion held battles on weekdays. Now the battlefield was crowded with disciples from the Dark Phoenix Pavilion. A few days ago, when Su Ro had received a message from Hall Master Yuan, she had informed all her disciples of the coming of Jian Wushuang. Many disciples seemed very excited. For disciples from the Dark Phoenix Pavilion, the lineage of Star was the absolute hegemony in the Star Land, with numerous admirable talents. Top geniuses of the Dark Phoenix Pavilion would only be normal disciples in the lineage of Star. And the best disciples of the Star Palace were the top of the top. So many disciples in the Dark Phoenix Pavilion were curious about those from the Star Land, and even envied them. Those envying disciples thought that they were actually not inferior to disciples from the Star Land. So, hearing Jian Wushuang coming, everyone was eager to have a look. When Su Ro and Jian Wushuang arrived, disciples waiting in the battlefield got excited. Here comes the disciple of the Star Palace. He looks just mediocre. It's difficult to distinguish one's power simply by his breath or appearance. As a disciple from the Star Land, he must be excellent. Many disciples were having a heated discussion about Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang could feel many beady eyes looking at him. Strong aggressiveness, Jian Wushuang thought. All right, be quiet. Su Ro started to speak. Her voice was very plain and soft, but it sounded like thunder in the ears of every disciple in the battlefield. Everyone in the battlefield immediately went quiet. I would like to introduce to you this disciple of the Star Palace, Jian Wushuang. It is a very rare opportunity to meet him in our Dark Phoenix Pavilion. You should cherish the chance. Su Ro smiled softly. As soon as she spoke, many of the disciples immediately got excited and aggressive. Su Ro is encouraging her disciples to challenge me? Jian Wushuang frowned. Lei Chao decided to say something. It's unfair to us. We are just guests who want to go to the Mind Cliff. Unfair? Su Ro questioned. Was it fair that you left me alone? What I am doing to your disciple is nothing compared with what you did to me. Lei Chao looked embarrassed. Su Ro sneered. I have always been in awe of the stars in Dark Phoenix Pavilion, and absolutely daren't cause difficulties for disciples the lineage of Star. But this time is different. It's you that brought him there. I just want to challenge you, Lei Chao. Su Ro said. Chapter 1414 Challenge. Chapter 1414 Challenge. Hearing what Su Ro said, Lei Chao turned pale with rage. The surrounding experts from Dark Phoenix Pavilion looked strange. They had known since long ago about the ambiguous relationship between their pavilion master and Lei Chao. Hence, they wasn't surprised by Su Roi's action. Soon, Lei Chao let out a sigh and looked at Jian Wushuang again. Jian Wushuang, go ahead and exchange some experiences with the disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion. All right, Jian Wushuang nodded. As Jian Wushuang agreed, the disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion on the training ground beamed with joy. The few that had wanted to launch an attack long ago immediately came forward. Jian Wushuang, I, core disciple of Dark Phoenix Pavilion, Lu Shar, want to challenge you. I've heard that the disciple of Star Palace from lineage of Star are all gifted, and they are all monstrous. I finally get to see it with my own eyes. Fight with me. Jian Wushuang, let me challenge you. I'd like to see how strong the disciple of Star Palace is. In the noise, there were almost a dozen disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion who stood out. Those disciples had soaring fighting intentions. They were dying to fight Jian Wushuang. Jian Wushuang creased his eyebrows. There's too many of you. If I were to take every single challenge, God knows how long it would take. As you are all from the same sect, you should know one another's power well. Why not pick 3 of your strongest to fight me? Jian Wushuang said swiftly. Hearing what Jian Wushuang had said, the disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion quickly agreed. In a short while, 3 people appeared before Jian Wushuang. All 3 of them were female. Jian Wushuang, I'm Lu Shar. I'm at the 3rd place among the universe gods in the 2nd heaven in Dark Phoenix Pavilion. I'll fight against you first. The maiden in a red robe named Lu Shar held a long whip as she stared at Jian Wushuang. Let's begin. Jian Wushuang looked solemn as he thought. As they are coming at me because of my identity as a disciple of Star Palace, I can lose the names of the disciple of Star Palace. I shall put the Dreamland technique to work straight away, and take care of them straightforwardly. Jian Wushuang had made up his mind. Very soon Lu Shar took action. The long whip in her hand suddenly transformed into a huge green dragon. The huge dragon gave out a strong power and charged toward Jian Wushuang. Before the disciples of Dark Phoenix Pavilion, Jian Wushuang didn't move an inch, nor did he take out his Blood Mountain sword. But there was a flash of crimson light that erupted in his eyes. The crimson light was like a crimson sun, extremely eye-catching. Everyone was attracted by the crimson sun uncontrollably. Ah! Lu Shar screamed in pain, and she went pale in agony. However, Jian Wushuang let out a sigh leisurely and dotted Lu Shar's forehead with his fingertip. He then dismissed the dreamland. Without the influence of dreamland, Lu Shar had her consciousness recovered, but she realized that Jian Wushuang's finger was on her forehead. If Jian Wushuang were using a sword instead of his finger, she'd be dead. How could this be? Lu Shar looked like she was in disbelief. She couldn't accept what had happened. You lost, Jian Wushuang said softly and turned to leave. Lu Shar looked lost, but the very next movement, she clenched her fist and looked at Jian Wushuang in his eyes as she stepped back. The sight stirred up a commotion among the disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion, surrounding the training field. Senior Lu Shar was defeated so easily. It's dreamland. Senior Lu Shar just drowned into phantasmagoria. Such a terrifying phantasmagoria. The disciples from Dark Phoenix Pavilion were astonished. He had lived up to his name as a disciple of Star Palace. He defeated Lu Shar, who was at the third place in Dark Phoenix Pavilion. Lei Chao, your disciple in lineage of Star has a really strong consciousness. His phantasmagoria seems impressive. Su Ro stole a glance at Lei Chao. He's not only good at this. However, the geniuses in Dark Phoenix Pavilion shouldn't be able to force him to put in his full effort, Lei Chao said. Oh yeah, Su Ro sneered. Then, the genius disciple on the second place took a stand. It's a pity that the disciple was around Lu Shar's standard. Her only advantage over Lu Shar was that she knew that Jian Wushuang was good at consciousness attacks and phantasmagoria. So she took preventative measures. Even though she was prepared, she couldn't resist Jian Wushuang's phantasmagoria. The two geniuses were defeated in an instant. Her defeated outcome was the same as Lu Shar. Of the strongest three from Dark Phoenix Pavilion, two were defeated in the blink of an eye. The last was a beautiful lady in black with a cold aura. There was a murderous manner in the beautiful lady's eyes. Ling Er, give your all. Don't embarrass your master, Su Ro spoke. Master? How dare you take a disciple of your own? Lei Chao looked at Su Ro in shock. Why? Can't I? Su Ro laughed. Lei Chao shrugged and remained silent. Jian Wushuang looked at the girl in black before him. He could feel that the girl in black was much stronger than the two previous girls. Come on. Jian Wushuang's voice was cold. As you wish. The girl in black didn't hesitate. She moved her wrist, and a black long spear appeared in her hand. Her figure moved, and she appeared before Jian Wushuang in an instant. Swoosh! The black long spear went through the void and flew towards Jian Wushuang. So fast, Jian Wushuang was surprised. Amongst universe gods in the second heaven, the only person who used a spear like this was Long Fei Bai. He was only slightly faster than this girl in black. Just slightly. Virum. The boundless soul power swept out, and suddenly Jian Wushuang had created a huge black tortoise. He blocked the girl in black's attack with the tortoise shell, while he quickly lifted his head, to put 18 Azura Hell secret skill to play. One would not be able to resist if he or she didn't have a certain level of consciousness strength. The terrifying effect of Dreamland surged around them, and the girl in black looked shocked. However, she recovered very quickly, and the black long spear in her hand never paused. She blocked it so easily? Jian Wushuang looked surprised. Bang! The black long spear hit the black tortoise shell, and a fierce power erupted. It shook the black tortoise vigorously. Kacha-kacha. There were a few fine cracks on the surface of the black tortoise, and the very next moment, it exploded. Broke my black tortoise defense with one stab. Jian Wushuang was surprised, and he didn't dare to drag on the match for any longer. A sudden boundless soul power sword. Roar! Along with the earth-shattering roar, a gold divine ape that was more than 300 meters tall and had a soaring rage suddenly appeared in the universe. Chapter 14:15 Mind Cliff. Chapter 14:15 Mind Cliff. As the golden divine ape appeared, its enormous power instantly converged on the palm of the ape's right hand. Boom! The divine ape punched the woman's black spear directly. Bang! With a loud noise, the powerful collision of the spear and the divine ape caused a great force to the woman, making her hands numb. The woman got nervous. The golden ape moved forward step by step and continued the attack. Boom! 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 Several big fists fell in succession with great power. The woman dressed in black defended with her spear, generating a strange whirlpool to engulf everything including the attacking force of the ape. Bang! The sound of continuous collisions resounded. Finally, the woman couldn't resist anymore. She was blasted out directly, extremely weak and exhausted. The giant golden divine ape that Jian Wushuang generated continued to grow in power, showing no sign of weakening. You are defeated. Jian Wushuang looked at the woman indifferently and calmly, but he was shocked in his mind. I had to generate the divine ape dozens of times, nearly consuming 70% of my power to defeat her. If she had used other secret skills instead of confronting me face to face, maybe I would have lost the game. Although the Dark Phoenix Pavilion can't be compared with the lineage of Star, the best disciples here are no worse than disciples in the Star Palace. As for the woman in black, she clenched her hands tightly, her eyes full of unwillingness. Ling Er, you can go back, Suro said. The woman nodded slightly and went away. Suro, she is an excellent disciple, she is too proud, Lei Chao said. If she didn't choose to confront Jian Wushuang face to face, but relied on her other secret skills, she may have prevailed against the attack of the golden divine ape. She's like you. Lei Chao knew very well that Su Ro was also a proud lady. Well, there's no excuse for the defeat. We lost, Su Ro said indifferently. It's incredible for a universe god in the second heaven to have such a strong consciousness, and also to have such a good command of the 5 beast soul manipulation knack. He is worth the reputation of Star Palace. Now can you take us to the Mind Cliff? Lei Chao asked. Come with me, Su Ro said. Soon, Jian Wushuang and Lei Chao were heading for the Mind Cliff with Su Ro. Jian Wushuang's battle with Ling Er had caused a stir in the battlefield. Disciples of the Star Palace are indeed powerful. That's true. I thought that Ling Er was already one of the most powerful universe god in the second heaven, but I was wrong. But although Ling Er lost, she could almost catch up with Jian Wushuang in terms of the overall strength. The discussion continued for a long time. The disciples had never seen the strength of the Star Palace disciples before. They had some doubts about the strength of the Star Palace disciples and wanted to challenge them. But now they had really witnessed the battle and realized that they were far behind. The Mind Cliff, located in the center of Dark Phoenix Pavilion, was a huge mountain standing tall. And the mountain was covered by a special power force. Now we are in the Mind Cliff, Su Ro said. Jian Wushuang looked at the huge mountain in front of him. The mountain was so tall that Jian Wushuang couldn't see the peak. In the middle of the mountain, there was a stairway leading to the top of the mountain. The stairway looked extraordinary. Heart Cliff has a total of 999 steps, and each step is an experience for the heart. The higher the stair is, the more difficult it is for the heart. Su Ro said, Jian Wushuang, since you have come here to cultivate your mind, you can first try your best to step on these steps and see how many you can climb. I see. Jian Wushuang nodded and started to move to the bottom of the mountain. As soon as he had stepped on the first step, a strong force came to surround him. Phantasmagoria. Jian Wushuang realized what the force was. Phantasmagoria was aimed at the consciousnesses and minds of cultivators. Specifically, being able to resist the phantasmagoria depended on the strength of the consciousness. If the consciousness was not enough, cultivators should turn to their mind. For example, the 18 Azura Hell was a powerful phantasmagoria. Cultivators without a strong consciousness had to undergo all kinds of torments. So it was also a test of mind. Only cultivators with a resilient mind could survive such a torment, or they would go mad. Now on the first step of the mind cliff, he couldn't resist the phantasmagoria, only with his consciousness strength. He could keep his mind peaceful and resilient. This phantasmagoria was like a prison. Bang! Jian Wushuang was tied to a pillar and could not move, while someone wielded a whip around his body and beat him crazily, causing many scars and resulting in a painful heart. This physical pain, it's nothing. Jian Wushuang thought it was nothing. He stayed calm and smiled. This first level of the phantasmagoria was only the physical pain of a cultivator's body, and only a tiny mental pain, which even ordinary people who were patient enough could easily bear, let alone Jian Wushuang. With a faint smile, Jian Wushuang resisted the whipping and kept still. A moment later, the first level of the phantasmagoria collapsed, and Jian Wushuang managed to step onto the second step. The second step was still the physical pain of flesh and skin. However, the pain was such that Jian Wushuang's skin peeled. Near the heart cliff, Lei Chao stood side by side with Su Rou. They watched Jian Wushuang walking up the steps. From beginning to the end, Jian Wushuang stayed calm, and he finally got into the 201st floor. It's all on the 201st floor, but he was still calm. His mind is not weak at all. Su Rou said. You are right. Lei Chao nodded. Then why did you decide to send him here? Su Rou asked. Chapter 14:16, The 400th Step. Chapter 14:16, The 400th Step. If I'm not mistaken, he should be here for the mind test, right? Su Rou looked at Lei Chao. The scariest mind test in God's test was aimed at the state of mind. It was normal for geniuses like Jian Wushuang to come across a mind test in God's test. Guess as you wish. Lei Chao didn't answer directly. On Mind Cliff, Jian Wushuang continued to proceed step by step. In the beginning, he was rather relaxed. However, when he reached the 300th step, he slowed down in speed, and he didn't look as relaxed as before. There was a hidden misery in his facial expression. There are 999 steps to the peak of the Mind Cliff, and he already felt a slight pressure on the 300th step. The following steps will be an obstacle for him, and it will train his state of mind. Su Rou smiled and stole a glance at Lei Chao next to her. She said, if there's no accident, the young man will spend another few years around this range of steps. Lei Chao, do you want to stay here or leave? I'll wait for him here, Lei Chao replied coldly. Up to you. I have business to take care of. I will not keep you company. Please do as you like. Su Rou turned around and left. Lei Chao was left alone as he waited in silence. The time flew past. Jian Wushuang had been on Mind Cliff all this while. With the aid of Phantasmagoria on Mind Cliff, he continued to train his state of mind. Then, he was standing on the 331st step when he suddenly opened his eyes. Then he took a step forward and reached the 331st step. The 332nd step. That's impressive. There were a few disciples of Dark Phoenix Pavilion gathered around Mind Cliff. They were astonished by Jian Wushuang's performance on Mind Cliff. I remembered when Senior Qiu Ling were challenging Mind Cliff back then. She only reached the 328th step. Senior Qiu Ling, among the disciples of Dark Phoenix Pavilion, regardless of power or state of mind, she was the strongest. Plus, she had trained many times on Mind Cliff. But she only reached the 328th step. Her result can't be compared favorably with Jian Wushuang's, even though he is here for the first time. Jian Wushuang is really terrifyingly powerful, and his state of mind is even scarier. The disciples were amazed. Stepping foot on the 332nd step represented the fact that Jian Wushuang's state of mind was strong. One should know that even universe gods on the peak to the minority of real gods, who weren't strong in a state of mind, might not even step foot on the 300th step. Jian Wushuang was still continuing his journey up. In the blink of an eye, 5 years passed. On Mind Cliff, Jian Wushuang had already laid foot on the 389th step. The 389th step. No, the 390th step. In the void next to Mine Cliff, Qiuling and Lu Shar stood side by side. They could see Jian Wushuang stepping foot on the 390th step of Mine Cliff clearly. Senior, it has been 300 years since you were last on Mine Cliff. You should have improved tremendously for the past 300 years. If you were to go on Mine Cliff again, would you be able to catch up with Jian Wushuang? Lu Shar looked at Qiuling and asked. No way. Qiuling shook her head directly. With my current power, I could only try to pass the 330th step. Among universe gods in the second heaven, it is considered rather impressive. But Jian Wushuang, he is so much more outstanding than we are. The 390th step. According to Master, there are many real gods of Dark Phoenix Pavilion who stopped at the 390th step. In terms of state of mind, Jian Wushuang is no weaker than those real gods. Monster. I wonder how he got his state of mind. Lu Shar sighed. How? Qiuling smiled faintly. Repeated failure and lots of training. Some geniuses are like that. The bigger the failure, the tougher the training, so they get to be even more brilliant. On the contrary, if a genius were to lack experience of failure and training, his gifted talent would be wasted. Jian Wushuang is that kind of genius. If I guess correctly, he should have experienced countless obstacles since he started cultivation. The obstacles that he has been through are not something either of us could compare to. He grew up through the obstacles and became who he is today. He is an impressive genius. I can't be compared favorably with him. Qiuling was a true genius too, and she was confident in her personal talent. She was not someone who would admit defeat easily. Even when she had lost to Jian Wushuang previously, she never thought that she was weaker than Jian Wushuang, but merely lacking time and chances. But then, looking at Jian Wushuang's performance on Mine Cliff, especially after Jian Wushuang had stepped foot on the 390th step, she decided not to challenge Jian Wushuang anymore. She knew clearly that Jian Wushuang didn't get that strong out of nowhere. I heard from the Pavilion Tower that Jian Wushuang is going to stay in Dark Phoenix Tower for 10 years. 5 years have passed, and he has stepped foot on the 390th step. There are 5 years left. I wonder if he could step foot on the 400th step, Lu Shar said. The 400th step? Qiuling's pupils contracted. I heard from Master that there are 999 steps on Mine Cliff, and the 400th step is a huge threshold. It isn't that easy to pass. The real gods of Dark Phoenix Pavilion mostly stopped below 400 steps. There is hardly anyone who has stepped foot on 400 steps or above. If Jian Wushuang were to step foot on the 400th step within the remaining 5 years, it would be really impressive. I hope he doesn't. Otherwise, our difference will be too vast, Lu Shar muttered. Let's go. Qiuling and Lu Shar left shortly afterwards. Jian Wushuang, who was by then on the 390th step of Mine Cliff, was suffering indefinitely in the dreamland. As he reached the 390th step, it was rather difficult for him to pass through even if it was his dreamland. A month later, he finally stepped foot on the 391st step. 3 months later, he had gotten to the 392nd step. The time continued to fly past. Out of the 10 years' time, there was only one last year left, and it passed in the blink of an eye. The second inverse cultivation test was ascending in a month's time. Dark Phoenix Pavilion, in the void by Mine Cliff. Lei Chao had been guarding Mine Cliff for the past 10 years. He had never once left. One last month left. Lei Chao was calculating the time quietly, while his gaze was fixed on Jian Wushuang on Mine Cliff. But then, on Mine Cliff, Jian Wushuang, who was stuck on the 399th step for a year, suddenly took a leap and stepped onto the 400th step firmly. As his foot touched the step, his figure shivered and his aura experienced a tremendous change. Chapter 1417. The first level of the mind status. Chapter 1417. The first level of the mind status. The 400th level. When Lei Chao saw Jian Wushuang had entered the 400th level, he was excited, with his eyes beady and a smile on his face. Jian Wushuang. That is enough. Come on. Lei Chao said. Jian Wushuang stopped climbing and came to Lei Chao. I thought you could learn how to control your mind through cultivation in the mind cliff, but I didn't expect you to be able to reach the first level of the mind status. It's really good. Lei Chao exclaimed. The first level of mind status? Jian Wushuang was confused. Haven't you found that something has changed in your mind? Lei Chao explained. Yes, I feel that, but I don't know what the levels of mind status are, said the Jian Wushuang. The mind status is divided into 3 levels, and the first level is a clear mind connecting with soul. This level is difficult for ordinary gods to reach. Even in the eternal chaotic world, many real gods have not reached it. Lei Chao said. Many real gods have not reached it. Jian Wushuang was surprised. Your second round of god test is coming. At this juncture, it's lucky for you to reach the first level in your mind status. It's time to go back. There's only a month left, Lei Chao said. Yes, let's go. Lei Chao and Jian Wushuang set out to leave directly. When he left, Lei Chao sent a message to Su Rou, but he did not meet Su Rou again. At an exquisite attic in the Dark Phoenix Pavilion. What an indifferent man he is. Su Rou was unsatisfied with Lei Chao. She asked her subordinate. You just said that Jian Wushuang reached the 400th level of the mind cliff. Yes, I witnessed it. So that means Jian Wushuang has achieved the first level in his mind status? Su Rou's eyes was twinkled with surprise. What a genius! When will my disciples reach such a high level? She muttered and sighed for a long time. After leaving the Dark Phoenix Pavilion, Jian Wushuang and Lei Chao went directly to the Cloud Island. Jian Wushuang, Hall Master Yuan asked us to go directly to the firmament world. He has been waiting for us there. Lei Chao said. Good. Jian Wushuang nodded. Soon, they appeared in the Cloud Island, and through a wormhole in the island, they went directly to the firmament world. The firmament world was lifeless and isolated. It was the perfect place for the god test. When they arrived, Hall Master Yuan was waiting there. How about your cultivation in the pavilion? Hall Master Yuan asked. Not bad. My mind improves. Jian Wushuang answered. Lei Chao added. He has reached the first level of mind status. Oh, Hall Master Yuan was happy. Great. It was very good for him to reach that level before the coming of the god test. God tests are extremely dangerous and full of life-threatening risks, especially the inverse cultivation test. I was quite worried before, but now you have reached the first level of mind status. I am not so worried. Then Hall Master Yuan took out several treasures. These are what I have prepared for you to pass your god test. These are 2 heart guard elixirs. Hall Master first handed the 2 milky elixirs to Jian Wushuang. They can make you feel calm and perform well in the god test, especially when your state of mind is affected. Jian Wushuang received the elixirs immediately. And these 2 are tribunal passing elixirs, for you to recover your wounds. The god test is aimed at your mind status, and there is seldom an attack, but you can keep them for unexpected circumstances. Jian Wushuang took the 2 elixirs. As for this, Hall Master Yuan took out a bronze mirror. The bronze mirror looked antique and extraordinary. This is the exquisite mirror. It also protects your mind at a critical time. It is one of the most powerful treasures in the lineage of star. Hall Master Yuan said. Exquisite mirror? Jian Wushuang looked at the mirror for a while, and then thanked the Hall Master Yuan. You are welcome. As long as you can survive the god test, all our efforts will be worth it. Hall Master Yuan said. Well, you should keep those things with you. There's not much time left. You should make good use of it, and keep yourself in an optimal state. Yes. Then Jian Wushuang sat down in an empty space above a vast sea to wait for the test. He would receive the test there. Jian Wushuang, the second round of the god test is more dangerous than the first, but it seems that you are calmer? King of Venomous Worms asked. Jian Wushuang said, Yes, maybe because I have experienced such a process before, so I am less anxious now. In my opinion, it has something to do with your improved state of mind. King of Venomous Worms said. Do you need to go out of my body during my god test? Jian Wushuang asked. I don't have to because the god test will be mainly a test for the mind, without attacking your force. That's good, Jian Wushuang said, then continued to wait. Huh. Jian Wushuang breathed slowly, making his heart completely calm. His heart was quiet, and even the whole sky was quiet and peaceful. He was now in his optimal state. The god test was coming. Chapter 14:18. The inverse cultivation test is here, a baby. Chapter 14:18. The inverse cultivation test is here, a baby. Rumble. Huge dark clouds gathered from all directions. The entire firmament world suddenly became dark. It was dark and misty. Jian Wushuang sat in the void, right in the middle of the sea region. His eyes were still closed. Although he felt the changes in the surrounding universe, he didn't move an inch. At the very end of Firmament World, there were two figures standing side by side. They were Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao. It's going to start. Hall Master Yuan looked at the huge dark clouds gathered above Jian Wushuang's head, and his face grew solemn. He experienced 9 sacred thunders during his first inverse cultivation test. The last one was a combination of a thunder test, fire test and mind test. His second inverse cultivation test should be stronger than his first, and it is supposedly aimed at his state of mind. I wonder if Jian Wushuang can pass. Lei Chao looked worried. No choice. As he is an inverse cultivator, he is destined to go through this test, Hall Master sighed. We have done what we could, we have prepared what we could. As for if he will pass in the end, it comes down to his own capability and his choices. Inverse cultivation. Lei Chao shook his head in silence. As the scariest inverse cultivation in eternal chaotic world, due to its abnormality, due to its quirkiness, the universe couldn't tolerate it. Above the sea, the dark clouds churned and covered most of Firmament World. The surface area that the clouds covered was a few folds wider than when Jian Wushuang had gotten through his first inverse cultivation test. However, as the coverage of the dark clouds grew, there wasn't much power within them. Forget about the pressure. There wasn't even one bit of destructive matter. This inverse cultivation test is uncommon. Hall Master Yuan's pupil contracted. With such a huge coverage of clouds, there isn't one bit of pressure or destructive manner. Lei Chao looked solemn too. In any ordinary cultivator's god's test, there would be terrifying force and pressure as the clouds formed, and the destructive matter would be strong too. Just like Jian Wushuang's first inverse cultivation test, the power of the clouds was earth-shattering. But now the clouds for his second inverse cultivation test, there wasn't any force or noise. Even the two top experts, Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao, couldn't tell the actual situation of the clouds. As it was unknown, it was even more dangerous. Just then, rumble. There was suddenly a crack on the dark cloud in the middle. The crack grew huge at a terrifying speed, and there was suddenly a cloud of dark mist that appeared in the crack. The cloud of dark mist didn't possess any sort of imposing or destroying manner, but the moment it appeared it was enough to frighten any cultivator. Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao, who were watching at the edge of Firmament World, saw the cloud of dark mist and were shocked. It's here! Splash! The cloud of dark mist covered Jian Wushuang's body like a flowing light. Jian Wushuang couldn't dodge at all, and let the cloud of dark mist cover him. The enormous amount of dark mist entered his body directly. The second inverse cultivation test is finally here. When Jian Wushuang opened his eyes, there was a sharp light in them. There wasn't any terror, only absolute calmness. Such a creepy feeling. Jian Wushuang muttered to himself. He felt the dark mist enter his body, but it didn't cause any damage to his divine body. On the contrary, he felt rather comfortable and relaxed. He indulged in the feeling. Gradually his consciousness became light. He was in total calmness. Deep sleep. Jian Wushuang's consciousness had entered a deep sleep straight away. Jian Wushuang! Jian Wushuang! King of Venomous Worms who lived in Jian Wushuang noticed his current situation, and got a shock. He shouted with all his strength, trying to wake Jian Wushuang up. However, regardless of how he shouted, Jian Wushuang didn't react. His consciousness was in a deep sleep. Unless he woke up soon, if someone came to kill him on the spot, he wouldn't know. Just as his consciousness fell into deep sleep, he closed his eyes again. Then he looked calm and friendly. He was even smiling faintly. The smile was very sincere. Then, before King of Venomous Worms, Hall Master Yuan, and Lei Chao's shocked gaze, Jian Wushuang's body was changing. His body shrunk at a rapid speed. His skin grew fair and smooth. Even his face became young and immature. In a short period, Jian Wushuang became a kid that looked the age of 8 or 9, and it continued. From the age of 8 or 9, he became 5 or 6, then 2 or 3. In the end, Jian Wushuang became a baby. Yes, a baby. A little newborn. This. Hall Master Yuan, Lei Chao and King of Venomous Worms and Jian Wushuang were astonished. Rejuvenation wasn't anything strange in eternal chaotic world. Some elixirs and unique treasures could easily rejuvenate someone. Even if one really rejuvenated, it was merely a change in appearance, and his power and mind would remain the same. However, Jian Wushuang in his second inverse cultivation test had become a baby. Without any power, just an ordinary baby. What is he experiencing in his second inverse cultivation test? Hall Master Yuan couldn't help but cry out. Unbelievable. The sight before his eyes was unbelievable. However, regardless of how unbelievable the sight was, they could only watch helplessly. It was a huge estate. The estate looked just like the kind a rich family would have. In the estate, there were many people walking back and forth. They looked anxious. Soon, she gave birth. Sir, Madam gave birth to a chubby boy. Along with the servant's delighted scream from the room, the people walking back and forth along the estate looked surprised. Congratulations, sir. Congratulations, sir. There were many who congratulated him. Haha, I have a son. I have a son. The estate owner was extremely delighted. Sir, quickly think of a name for your son, the butler urged. I decided on the name long ago. He will be called Mu Chun. He chuckled. Mu Chun, it's a nice name. Everyone, remember to take good care of young Master Mu Chun from today onwards. The butler instructed the surrounding servants. Yes, sir. The surrounding servants replied in unison. Haha, send my order down. Everyone in the Mu residence should be rewarded today, the master of Mu residence announced. The young master of Mu residence, Mu Chun, had been born. Chapter 1419, 9 Lives Reincarnation Test. Chapter 1419, 9 Lives Reincarnation Test. Family Mu was a family living in a peaceful time without wars. The father of the big family Mu was a famous businessman. His only son Mu Chun had been living an abundant worry-free life. Mu Chun was smart and eager to learn, and was talented with business. When he was 10 years old, he used his extra money, which was 10,000 renminbi he had accumulated, to start a business. In a short half-year, he had earned 200,000 renminbi, 20 times his original investment. His parents loved him a lot, and his relatives and friends all believed that he would be successful in the future. When he reached the age of 18, Mu Chun married his beloved with the approval of his family, and in the next year, he had his first child. Afterwards, he began to take over his father's business and expanded the business. Then he opened a gold store called Noble House, in which gold was sold. Soon many subsidiaries opened all over Mu Chun's country. In middle age, he continued to enlarge his business and became the leader of the local business association. Not only was he rich, but he also had great power, and even the emperors of every kingdom were in awe of him. In his 50s, he gradually handed over the noble house to his son, while he enjoyed the happiness of retired life with his wife. He was blessed by wealth and happiness throughout his life. At the age of 106, he passed away together with his wife, looking back on a life with no regrets. Beneath the vast black clouds, Jian Wushuang was sitting there peacefully falling asleep. But at that moment, he was not a baby anymore. He had become a gray-haired old man, who had reached the end of his life, completely still. King of venomous worms, as well as Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao, had no idea what had happened. They had seen that Jian Wushuang had become a baby, but then he had grown from a baby to a child, a teenager, to adulthood, and finally to an old man. He had experienced a person's lifetime from childhood to old age. They still had no idea what the reason behind it was. All of a sudden, it's beginning to change again. Hall Master Yuan exclaimed. Jian Wushuang had become a baby again. This was the second time Jian Wushuang had been transformed into a baby in the God test. This time, he was born in a royal family as a king's son, named Jin Mo. Jin Mo, at the age of 12, showed his literary and martial excellence, so that no one in the royal family was superior to him. When he was 20 years old, he succeeded to the throne and began to reform the whole court. It took him only 3 years to reform and stabilize the corrupt court. At the same time, he spent 7 years boosting the economy and building an invincible army of 400,000 soldiers. Then, at the age of 30, Jin Mo began to expand his territory and to exterminate the surrounding dynasties which were weaker than his. Within less than 10 years, he had made his dynasty one of the 6 major empires in the world. When he was 60 years old, he conquered the other 5 empires, and at the same time wiped out all the weak kingdoms and unified the whole world. He became the first emperor to unite the whole world. He did his best to make the people of this world live and work in peace and prosperity. People praised him everywhere, and his reputation lasted thousands of years. From ancient times to the present, no emperor could compare. Finally, the world was made into a real paradise, and the emperor died without regrets. Beneath the clouds, Jian Wushuang, once in the form of an old man, became a baby again. The third time, Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao both held hands tightly, feeling nervous and confused. They didn't know that Jian Wushuang was in the 3rd round of the reincarnation, each of which involved experiencing a whole lifetime. This time, he was a martial art player, whose martial arts were paramount and well-respected. He was named Lu Xian, and born in a village in the mountains. This village was named Town Lu. Within the boundaries of heaven, Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao looked at Jian Wushuang gradually changing from babies to an elder over and over again. Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao both got used to the rounds of reincarnation, but they were still counting the times. Buzz! Jian Wushuang's body changed again, from an elder to a baby. The 9th time, Lei Chao was shocked. 9 is the total of a complete series, so it should be his last change. Hall Master Yuan speculated. As Hall Master Yuan had guessed, Jian Wushuang did not go on becoming a baby or an old man for the 10th time, and gradually returned to his original appearance. He has recovered. Both Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao were excited. At the same time, Jian Wushuang's consciousness slowly came to life. Where am I? As Jian Wushuang woke up, a source of power in his body erupted, like a fire burning in his heart. The intense pain started torturing Jian Wushuang. It's the exquisite mirror. Jian Wushuang clenched his hands. He realized that the 9 rounds of reincarnation were caused by the power of the exquisite mirror. At the same time, all the complex memories of reincarnation rushed into his mind. These memories, a total of 9, were precisely the memories of the 9th rounds he had experienced in the God test, when his consciousness had fallen asleep. Mu Chen, Jin Mo, Lu Xian, 9 different memories with 9 different identities, all rushed into his mind in a moment. Jian Wushuang's face and eyes went red, and he was insane in a way which he never been before. Then he understood. It is the 9 lives reincarnation test that I am facing. Chapter 1420 Life and Death. Chapter 1420 Life and Death. Go through 9 reincarnations, combine memories from 9 different lives and recognize oneself. That was the 9 lives reincarnation test. Jian Wushuang, standing below the clouds, had bloodshot eyes which showed an unprecedented madness. In his head, The memories from 9 different lives were devouring his consciousness. I, Mu Chun, the richest man in the world, can get anything I want from the universe. Give me your body, and I will let you enjoy no end of wealth and honor. From the very first life, the memory of the number 1 rich businessman, who had built the noble hall, Mu Chun, was replaying in Jian Wushuang's head. I have been the emperor for a long time. The royal power belongs to me. Who dares to go against me in the world? This body belongs to me. From the second life came the memory of the emperor Jin Mo. He bellowed in madness. Chiu heir, my Chiu heir. Where is she? I'm going to look for her. No one can stop me. The memory from the 7th life brought about an unprecedented stubbornness that was going to eat up Jian Wushuang's consciousness. The 8th life, the 9th life. The memories from the 9 lives were like Jian Wushuang living through 9 different lives. The 9 Jian Wushuangs went through their lives in their respective imaginary worlds and possessed their personal consciousnesses and thoughts. They also had their own desires. For instance, the first life went after wealth. The second life went after absolute royal power. The third life went after martial arts. Simultaneously, the 9 Jian Wushuangs were living together in one body. Including Jian Wushuang's consciousness, there were 10 different consciousnesses. As the saying goes, one mountain cannot accommodate 2 tigers. There were 10 consciousnesses in Jian Wushuang's divine body. The 9 illusionary consciousnesses would naturally consume him and fight for control of Jian Wushuang's body. Humph! Jian Wushuang's face was distorted, and his entire body was shivering vigorously. However, his features looked ferocious, and he maintained absolute sobriety in his consciousness. Shut up. All of you are merely exist in imaginary worlds. You don't exist in reality and you shouldn't exist. Regardless of how much I have been through, how many emotions, imagination is imagination after all. Jian Wushuang clenched his teeth and bellowed. As you're not going to give your body to me, I shall die with you. The emperor from the second life, Jin Mo, bellowed. The very next moment, the illusionary consciousness merged with Jian Wushuang's personal consciousness. I'll fight with you. The other 8 consciousness took the same path that Jin Mo did. In that instant, 9 illusionary consciousnesses merged together with Jian Wushuang's. Previously, the 9 illusionary consciousnesses had existed in the same body as his consciousness. But then, the 9 illusionary consciousnesses were merging into his own consciousness. Suddenly, Jian Wushuang's consciousness was at the brink of collapsing. He roared. Who am I? Who the hell am I? Am I Mu Chen, Jin Mo, or Lu Xian? The entire firmament world could hear Jian Wushuang's bellow. Hall Master Yuan and Lei Chao, who were at the edge of firmament world, saw the scene and their faces grew grave. What's going on? I feel that his mind is on the brink of collapsing. Even the exquisite Mirror Heart Guard elixir won't be of help. It couldn't protect his mind. What is he experiencing? Hall Master Yuan was anxious. His mind is on the edge. If it were to persist, his mind would collapse. By then, he would become a mad devil. He'd rather die than stay alive. Lei Chao's eyebrows were tightly knitted as well. Both of them could feel the gravity of Jian Wushuang's current situation. It was definitely very dangerous. Only a little more to go before Jian Wushuang would drown in the unreturned path. Just that one bit. Just that one bit. He must steady himself. Otherwise he's doomed. Hall Master Yuan clenched his hand together. The two of them stared at Jian Wushuang and felt Jian Wushuang's change. Jian Wushuang stood at the edge of the cliff with half of his foot hanging off. At that point, even a casual breeze could send him into the bottomless abyss. Fortunately, he didn't step out the remaining half a step. Under the clouds, Jian Wushuang had become mad and let out an angry bellow like a devil. In the depths of his eyes, and in the bottom of his heart, there was still a hint of light. Jian Wushuang was glad that he had trained up his state of mind to the first level in Dark Phoenix Pavilion. It was because he reached the first level. His true will could just about maintain its tinge of brightness. Otherwise, he would have been possessed entirely. It seems like he managed to guard the last bit of his mind. Hall Master Yuan sighed a breath of relief. Even so, the situation isn't favorable. Who knows what he's going through right now? His last bit of mind, how long can he maintain it for? Lei Chao said in a deep voice. Even so, it's better than a collapsed mind. Now that he's steadied his last bit of mind, there is space for a struggle. Now it comes down to how determined the man is, Hall Master Yuan said. Determination. Yes, what Jian Wushuang needed then was to be determined. He steadied the last bit of his mind. As long as he could stay calm, until he could remove the illusions and recognize himself clearly, he would pass the test. But in the process, every breath was a life and death torture to Jian Wushuang. However, it would still be a while until he would undo the illusions and recognize himself. Naturally, his determination was the key element. Under the clouds, Jian Wushuang looked like a mad devil, just as before, but he had calmed down after his bellowing. In his sea of consciousness, his consciousness had drowned in an unprecedented chaos. Countless illusionary memories overlapped with his own memories, and it became complicated. In the beginning, Jian Wushuang couldn't differentiate himself. However, he guarded his last bit of mind. Gradually, he understood his identity. I'm a disciple of Star Palace. I am the husband of Lung Rushuang. I am the direct descendant of Xian Yi. I came from Green Fire World, Sword Marquee Mansion in Nanyang Land. My name is Jian Wushuang. A shrill scream reverberated through Jian Wushuang's body. In the complicated consciousness, his personal consciousness gradually took up the leading position. Then, he quickly started removing the illusionary consciousnesses one by one. During this process, every single step was dangerous. With the slightest carelessness, his own mind would have collapsed. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Wuxia Whispers YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.